Hey, Emily.
Apparently I'm wrong thinking about that, but I'm wrong most of the time. Seems to work out. Yeah, well, yeah. I mean, there's some we're not doing common ones. Well, I don't know if it's mad for it, certainly salutary tail. Yeah. Anyway, come on, back here.
That's right.
I'll find a way to make it about me, don't I? Yeah, cleaning myself out to the light at the moment. Has that already kind of gone away?
Yeah, sorry, I was just wondering if I could have just a bit of feedback, just so I can watch the lecture recording. It's not too weird, just what we can decide.
Oh, yeah, okay. No, yeah. Sure. I will probably put that like up to
Thank you so much. It's got a hole in it. I'm so sad. I love it because it matches this, and like when I actually re-dye my hair, it matches. I don't know if they have it anymore. It's an older season. It was like probably like 2 years ago now, and it was like their like autumn garden season.
It's still gonna go.
They've got an ocean one at the moment. Like dolphins and turtles.
What is? I'm not a fan of sea creatures.
Fair. Sometimes they can be creepy.
I have a fear of fish anyway, so I have a fear of fish and open ocean. That's called thalassophobia, isn't it?
Yeah.
Regardless, I'll probably still check into Pandora, but like I've already spent so much money. What is the price? I want stickers, historical performers.
Yeah.
Also,
It's gonna be so hard though.
I went with the yesterday and looked at socks.
It's really cute.
Thank you.
Really? It's such a good basic. Like that's what I think.
It's a body suit.
Because I was like, it sits so nicely. Like I can never get my shirts to do that. Like they just always bunch up.
Alright. I just finished my favorite stuff.
Yeah, I think it's.
I don't know
I'm so like.
Yeah, he said that honey is that, but it's like yeah, but number has fallen over the clock. Yeah, it's that thing called 20th. Yeah.
What's this for?
That one's also so gorgeous.
Thank you. I bought it from Boxing Day sale last year, so it's probably also still probably the stock. So this is the problem with being like a serial outfit repeater.
Oh, I love your outfit. You're saying that outfit repeating is a problem. It's just like, if it's good, I'm going to milk it for what it's worth.
Exactly. Yeah. It's like, you know, like you don't want to like buy all the clothes that destroy the environment. It's just like, there you go. Like this has got a hole in it, you can't tell.
Happy birthday! Happy birthday!
I literally just like remembered. I was like,
My friend! Oh, hello! I missed you. I haven't seen you in so long. Hello! Yay! Full fashion today.
Yeah, I have like a job thing.
Is that right?
yeah, no, there's
I have to
something
like
like this.
Pro.
How's it going?
Tell them it's your birthday and we'll get it instantly.
I think it was 4 hours from like 4
Oh, I don't know. What is that?
And I'm
The
like,
skinny one or the muscly one?
The one
No,
that
no, no. I
That
got
goes in one day.
Oh, with the one. Yeah. He died.
Where is
Well, obviously it's
it?
Yeah.
but his is so sad because
How are you?
I mean, I'm looking for reference.
I kind of gathered that from the Discord.
Drama. I cannot understand. I'm empathy for it.
I've been at my house on Wednesday for 4 weeks now. It's the worst. Like a week ago.
I see. Is that the game? Pullman. Oh, I'm sorry, historical. Thank you. Very good. Hey, we're silly.
It's like a process if anyone knows.
See the character?
I knew it was coming.
It's still the character.
I know you.
Oh, yeah.
When I was in high school,
I remember you're like,
super attached to this one Young Avengers character, Kid Flash.
and
And my
that's
friends
it.
were all
Yeah.
died in the last episode. I
Like,
really went to like a week of mourning from cartoons and little fast forward. Yeah.
Okay.
Everyone's gonna die.
It's like a,
Well, they're already dead.
I think it's just exciting. Yes. Like if I'm gonna die, it's not for the pain, boys.
Oh my god. You got attached to very, very, very dead men.
have you seen all House?
Yeah, but
It's kind of the same one. It's literally my main character. It's like a surgeon.
Oh, right.
It's just like a giant scalpel.
If they were gonna, on a you're safe. The only thing I think you might be able to pull you up on is like not doing high school. Like,
that's why I made an emphasis on like the
oh, it's thinking back.
yeah, on the outside.
Oh my god! Oh, I'm so excited! Oh my god! I was thinking if I can like smash my webcam and go to it.
Yeah, but on the outside it's really like
Oh, I completely get it.
Oh, that's nice. Yeah. But I can't believe people are doing both of it. Like I'm like sorry, I'm still like
you can see it.
I'm not really even really done.
Alright.
The weeks that I bark anymore.
And then 20 pages. And what was that like? Oh, I haven't done it.
Work when necessary. I'm not like I'm not a little dog that just goes far so far. And every person has to pass by.
I think that was.
I can't believe you're a monster. You're a monster.
Yeah, I know. It's kind of fun. Just like, yeah. So it's like, I don't know. It's like,
the front one's so fast. Like, the top, like, the damn sock is
It goes away when I'm just sometimes I don't want to put it's like, yeah.
I'm gonna smash my mouth.
Like, that's why it's like,
You know what? If they were trying to say, I should just be ready to like, I don't know. Like, I'm like the worst at composing myself, so I'm gonna fucking like. I'm gonna have to really keep confidence. I have to just kind of like. Feel the
So what was wrong?
it's just like, so we made an agreement that he'll do the sketch.
Oh, cool. So then I was like, I have to go.
Because I have so much work. And he's like, well, I'll give you some like sketches. That was like maybe over
Wow, you're in the work. Is it much of a
maybe
body
it
art?
was 2 weeks ago actually.
Yeah, I think like,
What the hell? I'm gonna tell my dog what's up.
like I was like, oh. Like I find it so difficult. Like I don't make them beefy enough, but like I always make them too big.
And then last night he just replied.
Beefier the better. Oh, I completely agree.
I'm like, bro, it's too late. A lot of them push it, but I can't the work. And then he's like, it's just flowing in. I'm like, I don't give a fuck. Like, I have so much time. Like, I don't even. That's good though. That's good. So it's like, it really like pissed me off. Like,
You got it.
I
Emily's
really
Alright, I'm gonna do my
I've been complaining for like.
I think I did that. I hope I can get it.
Waiting for Chris to pass me the work. And she's like kind of annoyed because I came on board to help this year because he was slow to begin with. And now I can't do much because I need to wait for him to pass it.
So use advanced.
It's just, yeah, it's like really annoying me because like it's building up in the wrong time. It's just really, really annoying. Yeah, it's like what's timing. So like, it's like it's just funny. I don't care. It takes a while. And it's like it's been changing a lot of stuff. So like if you want to build design, then you could just set stuff. It's just I don't know. Two clients process it. Yeah, it's crazy. Yeah. Yeah, you're doing more of them. Yeah. Yeah.
It'll take forever to do it. I want more now.
Morning, Tim.
Hey, how you doing? Just trying to figure out where I
Good.
left my files from last week. Cool. All right. I think I found it. Cool. All right. How's everyone doing? So I guess we're just going to do some feedback plus some extra material stuff this week. So we're going to add rubber and metal as an idea. And I guess the rubber and metal isn't really that tricky once you guys kind of have done some of these things. So I think we should probably spend most time on feedback because I'm guessing that's where, there'll be a lot of stuff that needs going over. But the basic idea of the rubber is that it's just going to be more sort of, it's going to be basically kind of matte, right? But it'll be a little bit shinier. So if we look at some rubber, yeah, so if you look at these, you can see it's basically kind of like just a very, very low gloss kind of bowl. That's kind of what we're dealing with. So the idea here is again pretty simple, right? It might have some texture on it, but you're basically with most of these concepts, you're just looking at slightly adjusting the matte versus glossiness of it, right? So if we look at, I'll get the Ferrari so we can use that as an example. If I can find it somewhere. Because yeah, we did I think the original Ferrari was like pretty sort of simple, but we did a sort of tweaked version of it to kind of play around with some of these ideas. So here you can see again, I've sort of on this one, I've started to add a bit of sort of texture and stuff like that. So often, if we're thinking about sort of texture, right, the idea of like what the base rubber would be is that we need to define its kind of basic material properties, right? Like how much is it going to reflect light? How much is it going to reflect, the ground, et cetera, et cetera. And a lot of what sort of adds that next level of realism is sort of the texture, which is whereby that sort of material gets broken up a little bit. And, you just kind of have to observe that. So here, again, I've used a very sort of simple sort of rough technique for kind of like getting some of that information there, as opposed to just using the airbrush, because again, I feel like the rubber tire is kind of, it depends whether it's brand new, right? Exactly what kind of tire it is, but the general idea is it's sort of overall it's going to feel like a rubber bowl, but the subtle sort of texture in there is going to be maybe a little bit more sort of broken up, basically. And at least doing that will separate it from a textural standpoint from the other stuff, if that makes sense. So there's kind of like what we're sort of doing here in general when we're studying the material properties of stuff is we're being very simple, right? Like don't make no mistake, we are being very, very basic, and the world is more complicated than this. And I think the way that you represent the world is that you, again, study the reality of it, like look at the photos and understand, firstly, what is the core basic material property there? And secondly, what is, the secondary sort of textural surface? And then how best are you going to show that with Photoshop or whatever tool you've got? So again, it could be a matter of, doing it all with one big sort of textural brush, or, as I've done, I'm kind of blocking it in, and then I basically just go around with a very small brush and just kind of like sketch around. So that's the technique, right? The underlying knowledge is sort of what's the core material property, and then how do we kind of modify it, to make it look less 3D and sort of fake. Yeah, I'm not really the brush guy. This is kind of how I did it, right? I'm like, let's get a round brush, make it small, and then I'll just sort of scumble over it a whole bunch. Yeah, so I would sort of do all of these things with sort of very simple round brush sort of concepts. And again, like, you don't have to be, I'll see if I can find the PSD of that, because the problem with the material rendering, just in the abstract here, is like, yeah, you can think about what the general material properties are of this, right? If let's imagine it is kind of a darker rubber, right? So we're going to start with a dark-ish sort of local color, and again, that the general shadow is not going to change much. And then we're going to go halfway to black, right, which is sort of 10. And got that. Right. So again, we're going to do the same old thing, because the first step is just block in the lighting situation, block in the general material. And once you've done that with a lot of these sort of surfaces, you can start to sort of engage your intuition or your sort of artistic mindset, right? So if we look at some of the reference, again, and that as well. And metal is another one of these things where it's kind of the same as chrome, right? It's just that again, it has different ways. Some of these things have different ways in which they sort of interpret the contrast. The right one, yeah. So it's kind of like just very subtle changes to that basic sort of reflection. And you can see that sort of stuff work in 3D a little bit, which is, sort of interesting. And we can maybe go back and check some of those things out, Simon, and look at, the differences between those kind of basic sort of objects. Can't quite find this.
Also, just on the brushes thing, I just literally have just downloaded Jamie Jones's brush set, and I'll just, because that's pretty common one, and I'll upload it to Flow so everyone's got it, just in case people don't have it. But yeah, cool. Then you'll have all of the brushes.
Yeah, that's a good one. Lots of people use that one. I don't know whether I've got that one here specifically but I think my brush set was basically his brush set right. I got the standard CDW one for some reason. If you want really sort of textured brushes, the Greg Rutkowski brushes that he sells are quite good for if you really want like really, really textured sort of brushes.
Yeah, those ones are awesome.
They're very good, but it's probably less so for this, right? And again, you sort of pay for them, so We can't sort of share them.
They're not very
But-
useful for boot camp stuff.
No, they're not. And they're really only useful if you really want to sort of approach that sort of style, which is, again, more obviously traditional, right? It's funny that, like, you know, traditional artists have been trying to make it all smooth for so long. And then, you know, digital artists are the opposite. So you can see here, right, where we have like really smooth objects like chrome, right, you know, sort of polished metal, you're going to get a very clear one-to-one expression of the material, right? The idea of what we're talking about. You know, this is sort of if you're in, you know, Blender or 3D and you kind of put on the material, right? And you're like, this is the metal material. The problem is with all those things is they don't look very good, right? They look very simple, but that's kind of where it starts. And with a lot of things, you know, that's kind of what you want because it's an artificial surface. But, you know, the rubber is, you know, it is an artificial surface, but it's been interacting with the ground and it's got sort of texture on it, right? So you can see, even though if we sort of zoom out, right, you can tell that, oh, it has like all of those sort of basic form properties that we talk about. The texturing on it is more nuanced, right? So you probably can't do this with like, you know, you would start doing this with the big airbrush marks, but we sort of would end doing this by, again, adjusting that texture in some way. And again, there would be a number of ways you could do that. You could use a big brush, you know, at a low opacity, or use a, you know, some sort of, again, some sort of like texture block over the top, you know, whereby, you know, you're not necessarily painting it in, you're sort of using a scatter brush or, you know, a photo texture or something like that. That's often why the photo textures are used, because they give the kind of simplicity of the digital sort of artwork a little bit of that sort of noise, which is often what you need. I can't find, I don't know where that other version of the Ferrari is, where I was kind of, so I'm just gonna have one last look for it in a different folder. But yeah, because there was one where I was like, let's go and add some more stuff to it. But I think it's probably in one of those Google Drive things that we were doing for a few years. It doesn't matter. But because I can come back to that. But yeah, so the basic idea is, you know, as I said, right, you sort of got your halfway to black. And that's really it, right? It might be, again, you know, like a little bit sort of glossy. And so we might sort of say, oh, you know, it has a little bit of a shine, you know, where we're sort of going to get that. That sort of highlight, and you might say, yeah, and, you know, we're going to get some sort of, some Fresnel effect sort of happening there. Always need to do that just a little bit. Bigger brush further away. Get a slightly softer sort of read on it. Right? So it's sort of, we're going to get that rubber effect by, you know, just applying a couple of really, really basic things there. And, you know, obviously, yeah, we might have, you know, like a tiny bit sort of reflected light, and you might go down, you know, and hit the ambient occlusion near that sort of shadow down there. And probably because the bounce light of that dark object is sort of darker, our shadow ambient occlusion, right, might get darker as well. So does that make sense? Let me know if you guys are sort of are with me on this. The application of it is very simple, right? When we're changing materials, right? What we do is we look at the reference that we've got, and we just kind of say, what base material is that? And right, so what base material is the rim, for instance? To me, it looks like it's kind of, it's obviously not chrome, right? It's not reflecting everything, but it's like more shiny than the rubber. It is more shiny than this black pipe here. So it's reflecting more, right, than those, but it's still a very diffuse reflection. There's no actual sort of sky reflection in it. You can see it's not reflecting itself or anything like that. So it's sort of a very sort of gloss metallic. So it's giving it some quite high contrast edges. The surface is quite sort of sharp and all those sort of things. So we're getting good sort of contrast there, but it's obviously way less way more reflective than the rubber, less reflective than the paint, right? And that's kind of what you do is we're kind of trying to separate the materials and see if we can get an understanding of like, you know, how that would sort of function. So if we, and this is why, again, it's tricky to know how to study this, right? Because we can do this with the different sort of cylinders and those sorts of things. Get out of my way. But really the sphere is the best way to sort of see it, you know, because you kind of see most of the form that way. And that's why we often do this sort of just with spheres. But the problem with the sphere is you don't sort of see how that sort of gets affected quite so much. But if we sort of say, you know, let's try and make a Photoshop. Yeah, let's try and sort of make a material sphere that's similar to that. Sorry, let me organize my Photoshop so I'm not, because I feel like today's going to be a day where I'm going to be jumping back and forwards. Yeah, and what we can do is kind of just, you know, so take that and a little bit bigger, right? So we can see what's going on. But yeah, if we sort of say, you know, I'm just sort of guesstimating what might be actually a local color there, right? But if we just sort of say, yeah, maybe that's like sort of 50% muddy yellow, you know, and we go, okay, halfway to black from that is going to be sort of at that sort of 25. So again, this is like, I'm just blocking it in based on, again, my understanding of material properties and a basic sort of halfway to black sort of system, right? I'm not sitting there eye-dropping any of that stuff or getting sort of clever with it, right? But again, you could, you know, if you're interested, you know, sort of look at, you know, how that sort of thing is sort of being affected, right, as it sort of moves into shadow. But you can see there that, again, you know, I sort of picked that, and then I sort of picked, you know, the stuff that's sort of in shadow, and, you know, it's actually pretty close, right? It's pretty close to sort of what I had. But obviously it gets darker as we get sort of ambient occlusion in there, right? And you can see also it's getting more sort of saturated and the colors are moving around a lot. So, you know, our simple version of this, right? Like the simple version that you get by doing this is always going to be not as good as reality, right? Like that's really important. And I feel like this is one of it's this transition that I feel like is the hardest thing to understand, Simon, is that we're often like, if you don't get to the point where you can just render your own sort of sphere or render your own cube and make it roughly look like a particular material, it's very difficult to progress to the next stage and have control. But if you only just sort of think about it as very basic materials and you don't start looking at photo reference or look at the real world, you're never going to get that next level of sophistication, right? Because the way that, you know, the sort of some of these things are going to work is we're potentially going to have like a, you know, a higher sort of temperature as we, you know, get sort of darker and darker. A lot of these metallic sort of, because this looks like it sort of has, it's obviously a metal rim of some kind that's been coated in paint. And a lot of the sophistication of paint is so that it sort of does change color or temperature as it goes from light to dark, right? Like that's often what they're sort of spending ages doing with all those paint flecks and special things. So you do need to, at one point, if you want to move beyond that, you need to look at how does the real world function, and sort of start to sort of look at this, right? And so if we sort of eyedrop here, right, we sort of, you can see that that's the color range in the midtones. And again, if I look roughly at these sort of shadow areas, okay, again, we're going much more saturated, right? So we're going from sort of 60 to sort of basically sort of 75, 80, something like that, right? And again, we're kind of, you know, we're kind of dropping down. Not that that's not quite halfway to black, but again, you know, that's kind of almost, it's probably getting a lot of ambient light. But then if we look at what are the sort of the shadow colors, right? Again, we're just basically jumping down and down in value, but we're also going up in saturation a little bit, if that makes sense. And that certainly could just be because that's what the Photoshop has sort of done, but that often is what will happen, right? We have cool highlights. Why? You can tell that the car's sort of outside and it has a slightly sort of blue, right? It's in sort of, it's overcast, but you're still going to have a cool light coming from above. So you typically have a situation where either you're going to have one of two things with lighting, and this doesn't have anything to do with necessarily specifically our topic today, right? Where we are doing the mechanical version of this. But if you want to sort of understand how to take it further, it's important to understand how these things happen. And yeah, typically you're looking at either understanding your overall lighting scenario and to understand whether you're going to have cool highlights and warm shadows, or whether you're going to have warm sort of highlights and cool shadows. And you typically want to sort of simplify things in that way because that greatly assists people's understanding of what is in shadow and what is in light. It's a key thing that we sort of understand. So in this case, again, you've got cool shadows, cool highlights, warm shadows, right? It's a bright day. You have a sort of a cool blue sky, right? That is reflecting a lot of the sort of lit top side of things. And you typically have, again, an opposing sort of temperature range on the shadows. So you can see it's getting, right? These sort of highlights are quite sort of bright. And again, this could just be because of the, you know, it could be because of the JPEG artifacts. It could be because of a number of things, right? Why it's sort of doing this. But it's interesting because this tells us a lot. But yeah, the shadows are getting more and more saturated, right? So it's not just that they're getting sort of darker and darker, right? They're getting, you know, more and more sort of saturated, right? So some of those things in there are sort of 90, whereas if we look at sort of the midtones, right? Again, it sort of goes down till it's in that sort of like 55 range. Does that make sense? Again, let me know if you guys have got questions in this. But if you were to sort of say, I want it to look like that, these are the kind of things you would sort of observe. Now, again, we're not necessarily making it look exactly like that, but that is really important to understand. Is like that these shadows are getting more and more saturated.
I think
right?
I think as well, Tim, it's really interesting to see that if you just, like Tim's saying, just really keep using your eye to see the subtleties and things. But you can also really see that on the wheel and also the, you know, the rim, that, you know, the halfway to black thing really kind of works, right? Like, so try to incorporate that more into your work as much as possible. Like, I feel when you're starting out, you're like, oh, I do like kind of the mid-tone and a highlight and then a shadow. And you go into the color picker thing and you pull the thing down to, you know, dark gray pretty much. And you like paint the shadow. Yeah. And that's like everybody's default. But when you look at these things, it's like that, it doesn't happen, right? It's like the thing is more subtle than you think. It only starts getting to black when you get into that ambient occlusion kind of area, right? And it's also one of those things where, like, don't be afraid to use black because ambient occlusion is black. And if you don't paint that in your paintings, they kind of look a bit washed out.
Yeah, there's lots of areas of, you know, even on the, you know, if you even on the metal there, you know what I mean? The area that you would probably say is the metal that's in shadow. Sorry, like, I mean the painted red metal, right? You know, it's going to black, you know, in some areas where you've got those little areas of ambient occlusion, and you do need those, right? You know, you can kind of see there, that's pitch black pretty much. I mean, it's not pitch black, it's like 5%, right? And again, it's sort of green for some reason. I don't know why. It's just, again, this is a JPEG of a photo.
Yeah, it could also just be the compression.
Yeah. But you can see again, like inside the rim, right? You know, you can see there's that same rim there where it's lit, and inside here, it's like super dark, right? We're getting heaps of ambient occlusion, but that's the same material as that. It's just tucked away there, right? And that's all sort of black. Yeah, you know, so everything's got that. Again, underneath here, right? You know, you look underneath the engine, right? It goes black. Even on, again, some of these, you know, these pipes that are sort of reflecting the ground, right? Again, if you know, that's sort of at 10% or quite black. So yeah, it's a matter of being subtle with it, right? Because you see with this, you know, it's really when you add that little darkness there, the ambient occlusion, like that's often, right? That's often where it happens, right? That's where the magic happens. So, you know, you can see if I'm sort of just eyedropping some of these things, let's see if I can. See, that's all going, that's going black. I'd like to be, it's probably not going to go, I've already gone pretty dark there. Yeah, so again, that's me sort of eyedropping it, right? And I'll show you kind of how I would get a similar sort of effect, right? Because I'm not saying like eyedrop it, right? But if you're looking at something and you're trying to get the material, like eyedropping something is perfectly fine. As long as you're eyedropping it to understand like what are the value relationships there, and then you're kind of able to apply it in your own way, right? You need to understand the logic of what's happening there. Then you can actually really leverage, right? The reference. We were talking yesterday about not being sort of controlled by your reference, right? And, you know, if you can just look at it and understand, like, oh, that's sort of what's happening with the value relationships, right? Where does it seem like, you know, the midtones and the shadows and the highlights are at in that particular sort of thing, then that'll give you a lot of, you know, useful information. But yeah, so you can see here, right? Yeah, we're sort of looking okay. Now, I don't have a lot of sort of reflected sort of light in there. Right, we could try and put a little bit of that there for fun. But, you know, again, if we sort of see the, right, so one of the things is important to note is, again, when we're sort of painting some of these concepts is as it moves to be lighter, right, it's not just sort of getting, you know, it's not just getting whiter and whiter, right? That sort of initial halo there, right, is going to be a little bit more saturated, right? So it's like that sort of one is going to be saturated, and it's going to sort of progress, right? Just trying to make it not look super airbrushy. Again, it's always just getting the right size of brush. And again, it's sort of going to hit at some point, and you could probably sort of ramp it up, right? Or you could use an overlay blending mode to, you know, approximate some of those sort of things, you know, because a lot of them do, you know, a lot of your sort of color dodge and those sort of things will really, you know, they really sort of crunch that down and allow you to sort of get that kind of halo, right? If you sort of, you know, do like an overlay, right, that'll often sort of give you that look, if that makes sense, where it sort of gets, it changes the saturation as it sort of progresses out. So often, you know, if you want to use Photoshop to do that, right, it will often, you know, really kind of help you do that, although that's, again, moving us towards a sort of warm highlights. So what you can do is kind of, again, just cool off the color, so move away from the red, right? So it's maybe, again, like a little bit more of that sort of greenish sort of highlight, if that makes sense. Again, that's probably a little bit extreme. We could probably use saturation of that a little bit better. This is just understanding like how overlay works, right? But yeah, so, you know, you can sort of see that that's kind of how we might paint sort of that thing. Now, the problem is, again, that, you know, if you have a whole bunch of material spheres, to a certain degree, they kind of all look the same, right? And it's like, it is the form that will really accentuate that stuff, right? Like a car rim looks most like a rim when it's actually the rim form with the type of materials that we sort of normally assign to it. But that's the basic idea. And again, this would be quite a smooth sort of effect. Whereas this one, right, in terms of like how to add texture, let's start with the most basic thing you can do. Because again, I really feel like, and I don't know how you teach this in digital painting, Simon, but the way I always approach this is like, if you can't get roughly the right effect with just a round brush, you're probably not understanding what's happening. Now, the round brush isn't the best way to do it. It isn't the fastest way to do it. It's not the way you probably will end up doing it, but you need to be able to understand how to just roughly get a particular material look, or, you know, make something kind of work. Because a lot of what you'll be able to do is, again, like I was doing with that, with the, let's see, how much do I need to go?
I think, Tim, when you're kind of starting out, you're like, oh, I need the brushes. And then as you get more experience, you're like, the brushes don't matter. But like, it's almost like you can't get to that point without, like, you got to sort of,
yeah, sure.
It's hard. It's a bit chicken and the egg, right? Because, you have to kind of learn how to paint that texture. I know recently I heard a thing with Craig Mullins, and he said that he's trying to, every painting, just paint it with the hard round brush, and he wants to paint all the texture in with the hard round brush, which is just insane, because then you look at some of his paintings and you're like, oh my God, this is all hard round brush. And you're like, I hate myself. Because they're like, they're so good. Like, you guys should just have a look, go goodbrush.com, look it up, and then like zoom in and look at the paintings, and you're like, oh my God. Yeah, because you might look at it and you're like, oh, whatever, there's lots of other people that sort of paint like that. But then you zoom in and you're like, yikes. So it's not about, you know, we always hear this junk. It's not about the brushes. Like, it is about the brushes, because they do help and you can get texture and stuff. But after a while, you realize you can paint the same effect with any brush. Does that sort of make sense? Just because you have the control and the understanding of how to do it, you know?
I had a great story, because I did a live stream series with Patrice Leigh-Murray from IEMAG a few months ago, and he said he's good friends with Mark Simonetti, who's quite a talented sort of painter, French painter. And he said, like, Mark was doing one of these live stream things, and someone you know, again, sort of asked the thing, like Paul Kelly, said, like, what do you recommend for brushes, or what brush is that? And I think Mark, like, got his face, right, from the live stream, right, the little sort of thing, and he made a brush out of the guy's face, and then he painted the whole rest of the painting with the guy's face. And I was like, that's the perfect answer to that thing, because you just make some brush out of anything. He's like, this is the brush I'm going to use. So yeah, it's like, it really doesn't matter what brush, you know what I mean?
So even though that's like a really, you know, flippant, silly thing to do, the high level theory of that is it's about control. Does that make sense? It's about you being in control of that tool to be able to get it to do what you want it to do. Does that make sense? So it's not, that's why I say, like, the brush does makes a big difference, because when you're starting out, it gives you texture that you don't know how to control, right? And it gives you that for free. So then you start being like, oh, I can add this, like, you know, little dots and blah, 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 and it gives you kind of free information. Does that make sense? But then after a while, you start to be like, well, I could just paint little dots and that would do the same thing, right? And just on that, I don't paint dots everywhere. I paint dots between where the Terminator meets the light. because that's where I want to paint my texture, because the eye is going to pick that up the most. And I don't need to paint it everywhere else because your brain is going to suggest and fill in all those details. Does that make sense? And then you're like, huh.
Yeah.
So does that, like, there's steps, right? So those brushes at the start kind of give you all this free stuff that you don't know why it makes it good. It just looks good because there's all this information in there. Yep. Because there's texture and stuff. But then, like Tim said, after a while, you can just do the same thing with a hard round brush, right? But you can't do that when starting out because you don't know how to do that, right? Yeah. So it's a flippant thing. People say it all the time, like the brush doesn't matter. I'm like, it fucking does matter. Because like if you don't know what you're doing, is like you can't paint that, right? So it really does matter. But do you get the flip side as well? Is that like after a while, no, it doesn't matter. But it's not because it doesn't matter just because it's stupid. It doesn't matter because you're control of that. So like, yeah, probably in that thing like Mark did, you know, he was still doing an awesome painting and after a while he would have worked out this face thing, gave him texture in a certain way and he would have used that in a particular way. And but he was learning all that as he was like quickly painting it. Is that kind of clear? So yeah, I hope that helps you guys because it is important, you know.
Yeah. So you can see, again, all I'm doing is I'm just using, and I think the thing is, again, I don't do any traditional stuff these days, but I started traditional a little bit because you kind of had to because there wasn't really any Photoshop, you know, so I started doing watercolor and I have a basic understanding of how those sort of things function, but there's a lot of different simple techniques you use to kind of get different textures depending on the medium, but all I'm using now is kind of basically, I guess it would be sort of like a bit of like a scumbling sort of, you know, layering technique where I'm just using a very low opacity brush and I'm just kind of scumbling or creating these kind of patterns, right? And the pattern I'm making is basically this. So it's just this pattern, right, over and over again. And it's not sophisticated. I'm not saying it's that good, but I'm like, it you know, it kind of looks different to what it did. You know what I mean? It has like a little bit more sort of nuance. And again, there's probably a bunch of custom brushes we could use to, you know, get a much better version of that. But I think if you're not, you're much better off kind of starting with round brush and kind of getting like, how would I do this? Because when you use the round brush or, you know, the round square or whatever kind of simple brush you want, right? It could just be, you know, like I have sort of the standard sort of painting brush I use is kind of this one, right? Which I'm pretty sure that is in that Jamie Jones brush set, right? But, you know, if I use this, the point is like, you know, this is not a brush that's designed specifically to give a rubber texture, right? I mean, that's the point. It's just a brush, right? And it's sort of how I sort of use it and how I sort of pick up on, you know, where those things are. But yeah, I mean, my painting technique is not good here, right? It's not great. It's just that I'm gonna understand what the opacity should be and sort of, you know, hack away at it. And again, but that's a particular technique, right, where I'm using low opacity and I'm chicken scratching a lot, right? So I'm hitting it a lot with low opacity, and you find like you can do a lot with a hard round brush if you understand size, opacity, pressure, right, and sort of what you're doing. Yeah, and the advantage of not changing brushes and using things all the time, I think, Simon, is it's simple. So you want the simplest set of tools you can get initially, because that forces you, right? The problem is if you go for the brush, you're going to be thinking like, which is the right brush, which is the right brush? And you could easily spend, I mean, I don't know, you could easily spend 2 hours trying every brush, because if you start downloading them, you know what I mean? I've got, you know, at least 2 hours worth of brushes here, and I forget exactly what any of them are. You know, I've sort of all these sort of things, and like, you know, but then I have like these are the ones that I use for I sort of made them. These are like my choices that I actually use for most of the time. And I think these are ones from some of the tutorials I make, right? And so I'm like, and those are actually, because those are the ones that I often use in tutorials without thinking about it. Those are the ones I often use. So the ones I kind of use are basically there. The ones I have are like sort of infinite, right? And again, you know, like very, very simple sort of set, because you think more about the material if you have a simple brush. Do I decrease the opacity as I sort of go on? Yeah, kind of. I mean, the way I was kind of working is, again, I blocked in the value. That's really key. So I'm not making any big statements. So you can see that this is not really changing, right? Texture on, right? Texture off. It's not changing the general statement. It's just sort of roughing it up a little bit, right? And I'm like, probably I could smooth that out again a little bit, but you know, it's not really affecting anything. So that's the key there, is I'm not using that textural kind of pass through. I'm using low opacity to affect stuff. I'm just using it, as Simon said, to change the textural quality of where it goes from light to dark. And as you can see, I haven't done a lot of work, you know, in those sort of dark areas or anything like that. But it's just very simple. I'm using sort of, you know, 30%, 10%, 20%, and you just modify those by pressing the number keys, right? So 10, 20. If you do it too quickly, if you do like sort of 12 or 13, right, it'll actually give you you can actually get anything, right? If you want like sort of, you know, like 9%, you just go, or 9, right? 76, right? But if you do just kind of press 7, it'll go to 70. And if you don't do it too quickly, right, you can just get, let's see that changing, 20, etc. So that's sort of what I'm doing. And you just kind of see, you know, like how much is this affecting? You know, if I sort of, you know, if I'm sort of there, I'm like, oh, that's probably doing too much. Because I just want to kind of be able to make marks and think about the marks, and I want them to be kind of loose and a bit rough, but I don't want it to affect things too much. So that's the general idea. You know, if you were sort of thinking like, you know, how do we, you know, how do you got that? Let's look at that. Like, you know, if you did want to sort of say, well, you know, could we add texture? It's like, yeah, but, and you know, the problem with sort of adding texture is that it's a lot harder to get it to sort of warp across the form. Right, so if you're sort of using some, you know, sort of scatter brush or something like that, right, the problem is that immediately makes it look two-dimensional, right? Like that's sort of the problem there, is those strokes aren't really ever going with the form too much. Right, so again, you could maybe try and say, oh, let's use the warp tool, right? You know, and let's sort of, there's all sorts of things you can do, but you're going to find like really limited application for that sort of thing, right? Like that's like not always gonna work the best, I think, anyway. You know, because you're going to be trying to paint that sort of thing. You know, but, you know, it could be good to, you know, you sort of get started with that sort of thing, or if it is a flat sort of surface, where you're going to have trouble with that is, you know, we can sort of see it sort of wrapping around, right? And we're not really going to see that, you know. So again, you can sort of try sort of textural brushes and things like that. Or you might have, again, brushes that sort of work better for texture, right? If I sort of, this would be another brush that I kind of have that does work well for kind of overlaying texture. And, right, all I'd be doing is kind of, again, scumbling that sort of quite sort of softly. If you wanted to sort of make, again, like a rougher version of this kind of metal, but you have to be like pretty careful, because, and you have to understand how the brush functions, right? So with this sort of brush, I'm going to get more texture from it if I kind of do it lightly. So if I sort of start, you know, doing what I'm doing now, I'm really only relying on the silhouette of the brush, right? So I'm not going to get as much of a, it's not going to quite work as well for sort of adding sort of, you know, texture within. Because again, brushes often have the silhouette of the brush, and then they have the secondary brush sort of process there, right? But again, you can see my process is probably the same. I'm just going to be like, yeah, let's. Right. It's kind of scuttle around. And the reason I'm doing it this way is again, like this is very reliable, right? Like figuring out how to just do stuff with sort of simple, small brushes, right, is very, very reliable. All I'm basically doing is just breaking up with some texture that, you know, that sort of initial sort of look, right? And again, you know, probably it's a matter of adjusting that a bit. And yeah, thinking about and that sort of Fresnel effect sort of stuff, which can be sort of quite tricky to put in. Have to be probably better off doing that with like a much less opaque sort of thing. So again, I'm kind of cheating, making it feel sort of round. Probably again, the Fresnel effect is going to reflect these sort of darker grayer colors just as much. It's going to be a sort of gray color. But again, that's the basic idea, right? It's just I'm going to get some of that sort of reflected there. Again, is it like how, right? Like it's not a mirror, so it's not going to reflect like, you know, the actual sort of color down there, right? It's going to be a little bit of a mix of sort of the, you know, we've gone too far. But yeah, just again, doing it in a really sort of brutal, dumb way, like a hard brush sort of way like this, is that you can easily sort of go back, right? You're less sort of stuck there trying to sort of be a proper painter. You can sort of think more about what is the material or whatever. But yeah, you know, adding sort of some texture to it. Again, you can sort of feel like, is that too much? Are we better off back kind of where we were? Yeah, so it's the same sort of thing, right? It's just like a general sort of texture pass, so it doesn't feel quite so sort of, yeah, quite sort of fake. But the thing is probably, if you're dealing with something that's like that rough, you're probably not going to get that sort of specular highlight as well. And that's what you got to play around with, right? It's like, are we adding texture? Like, you know, can we find a version of something that kind of has that sort of level of texture? Because again, that's where you're going to run into trouble, is where you kind of have something that's super shiny. It's got a nice sort of highlight on it, right? But it's like, well, you wouldn't have that highlight, would you? If it was that rough, right? It would be a different sort of style of material. Yeah, anyway, so that's the basic idea, is we're just sort of thinking about those materials, right? And really, again, that one sort of probably needs to stay like that. Yeah, and then you just sort of, you know, play around with it and think about the sort of the texture. Now, again, you don't necessarily need to add that same sort of style of texture. You can play around with it if you want. But I think it's better to do something like that, like have a go at this sort of Simon, because I do feel like otherwise it is just sort of super, these become like very repetitive, right? Because you're just talking about that sort of base material. So maybe we could do, you know, some way, you guys, if you feel like you're comfortable enough and you feel like your bases are sort of good, then sort of have a go at some of that textural stuff. But in most cases, this is what we see, is like, you know, if this looks wrong, it's rarely because of the texture. It's mostly because of the underlying logic of it, right? That it's sort of not looking good. Yeah, cool. Anyway, I think we should probably take a quick break, and when we come back, again, probably what I'll do is I'll just do a few more of these, right? So we can get a feeling for, like, again, just what I'm talking about, and just repeat that sort of idea a few times on different forms. Because the thing is, sometimes it's sort of, you know, on the, you know, on the cube, it's going to look different. But the other thing that's tricky is it's like, well, how do we sort of make this look like rubber, right? Because rubber probably wouldn't have these super sharp edges. So again, we're going to sort of do our best and sort of think about that, right? Yeah, cool. But anyway, I reckon we should take a break and we'll come back in 5 or 10 and keep going. So yeah, think if you've got any questions about the textures or whatever, yeah, let us know.
Sounds good.
Do our best to answer. Cool.
Hey Simon,
Hey,
can I fill my bottle in the kitchen? Is that alright?
just get Jazz will do it for you.
Alright.
Yeah, so just give it to Jazz. She'll fill it up for you.
I regret choosing this one. It's like, that's like a whole life that was. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I just want my whole life to be that was so that is the best way to do it. All I have to do is like, you know, super like overexposed. I don't know, just everything so it's smart and not hard. Yeah, just look at it. Thank you.
Yes, it is a common thing. So it's not, that's, it was a bit of I think it's normal.
face. That's not even blind one. It's so cool.
That's maybe like a well, no, it's a model test and then
But you can have like the ones that push you showed me some last week with the right one.
oh yeah.
Are you gonna go?
Oh, that was from last week. Yeah, I didn't cover it because
There are some good ones. I really like very good.
Right, I'm back. So let's do a few more of these just quickly, so we sort of get the idea for kind of how that might work. Sorry, just adjusting this microphone a bit. Cool. So obviously, if we look at the cube, we've got the square here. It's not a square, it's a cube. And yeah, if we take that same value sort of range, right? Where we sort of got our, forget what it was. Yeah, maybe sort of 20. That in. And then we got out sort of halfway to black, which is kind of square, right? And then we've got, again, maybe somewhere halfway in between there. So again, this is going to be similar sort of value structure, right? Now again, the trick here is like, this is a square and it's sort of a cube. And again, rubber, one of the, iconic things about rubber is it is sort of, it's rubbery. It sort of doesn't often have these sort of hard edges. So, in many cases, this is probably not the best one to kind of play around with the rubber. But we can think about, how we might sort of play around with that potentially. So the first thing is let's again, let's try and do some sort of basic sort of blocking in on this, as we sort of know. So one of the things is probably we're going to have, again, a bit more sort of ambient occlusion, because we're sort of reflecting something that's a little bit sort of darker. Again, not by heaps, but you're going to get slightly darker than it was before, perhaps. All right, and we're potentially going to get, again, a little bit more reflective than than it might be normally, right? So it's not 100% matte, it's like a little bit sort of reflective, right? So we might be a little bit more likely to get some reflection from the ground. Like that. So I'm a little bit less worried about making it 100% sort of pure, because again, I know that, you know, we might sort of add a little bit of sort of texture here. Try and make sure we do get that kind of this little sort of reflection there. And this will all live or die based on how subtle it is, really. And so you can see again, that's a little bit sort of rough. If we do square right, again, I think we can just sort of make things a little bit sort of darker on top. Right, again, like a little bit more reflective potentially than our sort of matte surface. Again, no unfounded gradients across the plane. It's just going to be straight, right, straight up and down. All right, but I think, yeah, maybe, you know, it's going to be a little bit more reflective than our typical matte cube. And on the top, again, you might find that maybe it's a little bit lighter, right? Like a little bit, right? So that sort of contrast is a little bit higher. That makes sense. So it's just kind of thinking about, well, it's a little bit more reflective than a matte surface, right? We're going to get sort of slightly shinier reflections, so we're going to get a slightly more sort of contrasty version of that, right? I.e., you know, the bright is maybe going to be a little bit brighter, a little bit shinier. Again, also, you know, we might have some Fresnel effect on the top and stuff like that. So that's how I rationalize that. And again, we sort of got. And this is sort of tricky because if we look at the edges, they're quite sort of harsh. Let's rotate this round. So yeah, basically it's difficult to rationalize there being some ridiculously you know, round or big highlight, because the silhouette tells us that that's a very harsh thing there. Silhouette tells us this is a harsh edge. So we sort of need to, oh, that's on the wrong way. Yeah, we need to respect that, basically, respect the silhouette and the actual drawing that's there. Yeah. Come on. something like that. And then something like that. And then basically I'm just going to erase all of this stuff, right? And erase that. Erase that. And hide that. Erase that. That'll give us, like, again, something to work with. So obviously that's too much, right? And again, it looks really sharp. And this is why often if you're, if you are just trying to sort of add, add materials in 3D, it's often not going to work because you sort of need the, you're like, oh, it needs to look like rubber. And it's like, well, you kind of need the typical iconic look of rubber from the object as well, right? That's where you're really going to see it sort of work. But again, that would be that would be sort of as far as I would go. And again, it's not going to look heaps like rubber. We could maybe try adding some texture, right? So try let's make that even fainter. I don't know whether this will sort of help or hinder or whatever. But again, we just basically add some super rough texture there. Now you can see again, this stuff is, I'm painting very low opacity, and I'm also, I'm sort of picking very subtle color transitions and stuff. But yeah, what you want to do is kind of think about what are some sort of abstract marks that sort of might work, right? It could be sort of, again, sort of blocks of sort of value. It could be sort of, again, sort of squiggly sort of lines. It doesn't matter as long as it's kind of sort of uniform. So I'm upping the opacity because this doesn't seem to be making as much of a difference. And again, this is the kind of stuff probably on the stream. This is all going to be sort of compressed out, right? But again, it is giving us like a slight sort of texture there, right? Same thing over here. So we don't need as much there. And if you finding like there's not enough, this is another really key point, right? Is if you are finding that you're not getting the right amount of contrast, then it's important to look to maybe the background or other ways to sort of get that read, right? So, often what we might need to do if we're sort of dealing with a lot of sort of, there's a lot of this sort of rubber here, so maybe just make that background a little bit darker, right? That's going to let those sort of gray highlights at the top pop out a bit more. Always think about that stuff. Do we need, do we need more contrast via actually adding more contrast, or do we need more contrast by adjusting the background, foreground, right? Like what's behind something. All right, one more. Let's try the spheroid. And again, so we've got like a 20%, if I remember, and the shadow is 10. Right, so we've got this sort of look. I'm going to gradiate that transition once I've sort of got it there. I'm going to again try and sort of push the transition from top to bottom, put a gradient in there. Then we're going to have a little bit of sort of reflected light And then putting in that sort of shadow there. Again, just sort of roughly. Actually remembering from the reference, it's quite, doesn't quite go off as much there. A bit more like that. And I feel like that reflected light is maybe a bit much. Need to darken that down a bit, I think. All right, let's go for, again, like a darker ambient occlusion. Sort of hit there. And yeah, probably, again, I feel like this reflected light is a bit, or at least it's going to be over here as well. All right, it's going to be quite strong over there too. And of course, we've got our sort of soft sort of highlight, right? And again, the rubber, there's like a little bit of that sort of gloss on it. Right. Again, that's probably a little bit sort of harsh to it. Right, so again, that kind of rubber look, that makes sense. And again, we could do the same sort of texture on there, but that's the basic idea, right? Just repeating those same sort of concepts and try and get it to feel like that material. So if let's again, cylinder, the same, pony. All right, cylinder top. All right, cylinder top might be a little bit more. Cylinder body, again, we've got our sort of shadow, and we know from, again, you know, looking at that sort of reference that, you know, if it's sort of fully glossy, you're going to see that sort of weird sort of shadow. But I'm trying mostly to sort of that form. And so again, we might have some of that sort of reflected light. We know that we get the sort of shadow and illusion, creating that weird sort of shape. Again, I'm going to darken up the shadow. And probably not a huge reason to darken up as much as I am. I'm just kind of going a little bit there. And what we want to do again is sort of just play with that. We've got that sort of gloss. And again, we're going to have like a little bit of sort of reflected light, a little bit more reflected light at the bottom. Yeah, just getting stuff up, just guessing what it might look like. And again, we're going to sort of have that sort of glossy, cylindrical material. Right, again, that might be a little bit much. And we could sort of play around with having that sort of Fresnel effect sort of idea. So it sort of turns away from us, right, getting a little bit more sort of reflection. But a big part of, you know, many of these things is that, you know, where you're going to tell the story of the material, you're going to have like subtle sort of gradients, but again, not heaps. is in that sort of transition, right? So it's sort of the go and see if we can. See if we can sort of do it this way. That there. So bigger, let's sort of warp it. Again, this is one way you can do it. You saw me the other day sort of try and do it differently. I don't know whether this will work, but you can certainly try this sort of stuff. All right, it's probably going to end up being too big, but that's all right. And always it's just like hide the warp stuff and still, all right, still sort of modify it. Yeah, I think it's getting too big. That's all right. I reckon we'll be able to resize it maybe. Yeah, so it's funny, like often these things, it's like, oh, this will save me time. It rarely actually ends up saving time. In my experience, in most cases, it's just gonna, you're better off just drawing it. Right, but you could, again, you could try something like that. Come on. Is this still at the top linked? No. Basically just have to raise that out. And I mean, it's not the worst. It's not great though. Try and hit that a bit more. And also, you know, it doesn't need to be quite as bright as it is in the middle there, right? So we can certainly fade that out. So again, it's not going to look super rubbery, right? Because it's just the cylinder that's kind of sharp, right? But certainly, you know, you could play with the texture there, right? Like adding some sort of texture to it. Select bottom, top. Put a mask on. So, silly round brush. All right. Need a lower opacity than that. And again, often with these things, right, you can put some texture on. You can also then, you know, like lower it in opacity, right? So I can sort of, you know, add a bit of sort of stuff, and we could probably again use a smaller brush. Do the same thing. Here I'm just using sort of squiggles. So you can kind of see them. You can see that this is sort of quite, again, just silly. pen pressure, if you have, and well, Cintiq thing do you have? Like, what do you use for it? Because the stuff the newer Wacom doing subtle stuff, right? Just lowering the opacity, right?
Hey, Tim.
You're talking about pen pressure. The way I'm controlling that,
Hey, Tim.
heavy hand, right? So that kind of solves that.
Hello.
Yeah.
There's obviously a lag. Yeah, you're just like cutting out a bit, Tim. So just repeat all of that. We didn't hear it.
Yeah. Give me a sec. I'll connect to a different thing.
All good.
Am I back?
Yes.
Yeah, I thought it was being connected. I don't know what happened. What were we talking about? Pen pressure, is that right?
Yeah, you were saying about the heavy-handed pen pressure, and then it sort of cut out.
Right. Yeah, a lot of it ends, again, what Wacom you have. You can have the newer Wacoms are better for that. The way I'm solving that really is just lowering the actual opacity in, yeah, so I think that's what I'm working on, is the 16-inch Cintiq at the moment, and that does have the Pro Pen 2 technology. So you can, if you are sort of heavy-handed. I mean, there's a couple of things there. One is like it's probably not good to be heavy-handed because I think that won't help you with wrist issues in the long term. You know what I mean? So I think to a certain degree, you want to kind of try and set up your drawing system so you're not sitting there with a death grip on the pen, sort of like smashing it. But the biggest thing is just to adjust the Wacom properties, right? And sort of play with that. So if you sort of look at, right, so you can adjust the pen settings, right, to make sure that you can sort of adjust it to be soft or firm. You often don't have to go too crazy, right, but just one either side will kind of help you a lot. What I find with the Pro Pen 2 stuff is like it being very sensitive is really good for drawing lines, but for painting, I think it's often better for it to be softer, because that way, you can sort of get more thick and thin sort of lines, But yeah, the main way I'm controlling it is with the opacity. So I'm setting the global opacity, right? So no matter how hard I press, it's not going to sort of help. You could sort of play around with like the actual pen as well. So I have one of these. I can't show you because I don't have my, right? I don't have the actual thing there, but like if you have one of those, like kind of plastic grips for it. Where is the thing? Yes, I have like one of these that's sort of ridiculously expensive, really. Sorry, I was just making sure no one was, like Simon wasn't messaging me to be like, you've cut out again. Yeah, so I have one of these, and it's kind of like those, those sort of, ones you can get for pencils. You could just wrap a whole bunch of tape around your Wacom 2. These things are okay, they're not great, but it does kind of stop you, because it's sort of bigger, it stops you kind of gripping it quite so sort of harshly. Yeah, I feel like just some different stuff is good, right? Which is tricky if you've got like a Wacom pen, because you can't just use different pencils all the time and stuff like that. But yeah, that sort of does it does sort of mean that you can kind of grip the pen quite sort of tightly, but it doesn't, it's not quite the same because it's sort of a bit rubbery. Yeah, so that might be worth sort of looking at if you have a natural kind of like hard grip. Yeah, but the basic idea is we just adjust the global opacity so that no matter what happens, right? And this means again you're less. I can draw with my shoulder a little bit more, right? So I can kind of just sort of be a lot more sort of like looser, and I don't have to sit there controlling it as much. If I sort of put this on full opacity, right, where I could just kind of do a full mark, I can still do the same sort of thing, right? But I need to be like very sort of faint. And what I just sort of tend to find is you just sort of tense up a little bit, right? And that kind of tends to affect the sort of strokes you make. Whereas if we set it to a low opacity, right, I can kind of be a lot crazier and it's not going to sort of affect it, if that makes sense. Yeah, but those kind of things are important, right? Like that sort of stuff you kind of have to figure that out if you have a particular sort of way of drawing or something like that that's quite sort of harsh, because it can hurt you in the long run, just from a like ergonomic point of view. Anyway, I don't know whether that looks very rubbery. It looks kind of rubbery. Right, and again, I would say like using these techniques are very risky, because you can easily make it look way too overdone or whatever, right? So it's really a matter of being kind of subtle with it, right? We can sort of reduce that opacity a little bit. But you can see even just adding a little bit of that stuff just helps make it feel a little bit less sort of uniform. Desk chairs for artists with bad backs and necks. I don't know if your back's already
We've
bad.
spoken about this before. haven't we?
Oh yeah, you were. Yeah, I mean, I just recommend the Herman Miller Aeron chair because that's what I have, and I still think it's the best sort of ergonomic chair you can get. But they're sort of like $1,500 to $1,800. They're quite expensive. The real trick is you need to move around, right? So you want the ergonomic chairs. I would personally recommend against going and just, if you go to like the ergonomic chair shop in Adelaide, they'll try and sell you a whole bunch of stuff with lumbar support and my neck's bad as well. They're like, here's like a neck support thing. Typically, I think the advice that most sort of, again, if you're in like sort of chronic pain, do you know what I mean? And it's like it's completely stuffed already. That's maybe sort of a separate issue. If you're trying to avoid it, you don't want any lumbar support. You don't want any support of any kind. You basically want to say, if you get uncomfortable, you need to move. That's it. Like stop doing it. Your body's telling you, there's pain. Like sort of don't do that. So it's about moving around, and that's what those sort of ergonomic sort of chairs do, right? So if you sort of look at.
Yeah, while Tim was looking that up, so I am the king of back pain. So I've had really
Simon knows.
severe back surgery. I tore 3 discs in my back, and I lived with it for maybe 5 years and had chronic sciatica in my legs. So like I literally couldn't walk from here to the door. Like that was impossible basically. And so it'd be like, sitting down, just get intense pain and all that kind of stuff. It's got nothing to do with the chair, right? So I had surgery and stuff and fixed my back up, and like it's not even a problem. Yeah, just like sit on the chair. So I think it is sort of like, I think all that chair stuff is just complete shit. They're just like selling you an expensive chair and whatever. Like it was a $50 chair. It does the same thing, right? Like, yeah, it's more about what Tim said. It's more about the other stuff. So you got to try and fix the back problems, which are not to do with the chair. It's to do with like other stuff that's going on, right? So yeah, that's the hard bit, trying to fix that. Yeah. So, and just like moving around, getting up and doing that sort of stuff is better. You know, maybe like try and get a sit-stand desk or something. Like that's probably more beneficial. You know, like I hate the sit-stand stuff because standing up compresses my discs more, so that I get more painful. Like that annoys me more than like sitting on a chair. Like sitting is really comfortable because it like there's no compression on the disc. So so I think that it's more about those other things, like getting a ball or something, you know, sitting on that, because, you know, that can increase your core muscles and stuff. Like it's, you know, like when you go, it's all the other crap you got to do, right? It's like to do sit-ups, that's probably going to help. You know, instead of spending $18 on a chair, do 100 sit-ups every morning, and that would be, it's probably more beneficial. Yeah. But, you know,
I think
these chairs, I think what's good about these chairs are they last a long time. So like if you buy one of those Aeron chairs, like Tim, you know, you have it for 25 years, right? You never have to buy a chair instead of every 5 years.
I've still got it.
Buying another $100
It's literally
chair.
the first thing I ever bought.
Yeah.
It's the first thing I ever bought with my like freelance money. Yeah. Like literally the first freelance check I ever got, I went out and bought a $1,700 Aeron chair. I'm sitting in it right now. Same chair. And like, I think my dad bought one recently and I was like, oh, this is so much nicer, but like this one's still fine, you know? But the trick with the Aeron chair, and this is just, I'm not like a product sort of, but I still think it is the best chair you can get. And it's like, it's sort of, you know, it's cool in summer, which I think is important for Australia. But the thing is it moves back and forwards, right? So you can sort of perch on it. Again, it's not very good because you guys can't see, but you can kind of lean back in it. You can set it to have like limits for back and forward movement. You can sort of have it sit up. It does have like lumbar support, additional sort of stuff. You can get it with a headrest. You can get it in different colors, different sizes, right? It's the number one sort of ergonomic chair. There's lots of other ones. I wouldn't bother, to be honest. I still think it's the best one if you're interested in that, because again, it's just, this thing is a friggin' tank. You know what I mean? It's so heavy. It's so chunky. And it will literally last forever. But the thing is, it lets you move, right? So you kind of, you know, you get a bit uncomfortable, and it's very easy, right, to just sort of move around in it. That's what sort of works. I would say, you know, other things that might be sort of good, you can get like, if it is a real problem, you basically just want options. So if you don't have one chair that can move around, I'd get like a couple of chairs that do some different things, right? You can get quite sort of cheap perching chairs. I don't know whether you guys have sort of seen that, right? Like, so it's a chair where it kind of, and again, cheap as in like not $1,800, but these things sort of allow you to kind of move around, right? So you kind of sit on it, right? And it will kind of rotate around a little bit, right? So you kind of are not necessarily just sitting down in it, right? It's kind of, you're sitting up on it. Where's it good? Yeah, I think there was like, yeah, so you can see there, right? Basically, sort of the basic idea of it. But I reckon just a really cheap stool can be good. Get like a $10 stool from IKEA. Because basically you can't sit on a stool badly. You fall off, right? So you can't relax into it. you kind of have to sit up straight, be alert, and as soon as you sort of start to get tired on a stool, right? And by that I just mean like, like literally.
Yeah, a stool can be quite good. I think if you do get a sore back and stuff, having things like the balls and those perch things with the curve thing where you sort of like meant to rotate around stuff. I think all that stuff's like junk because it's painful to sit on because you're engaging your muscles all the time. It's totally good if you're like a fit, active person that's trying to like do that. But if you're like trying to do art and stuff, it's like you're literally having to control your abdominal muscles while you're sitting on. I just think it's stupid. Right? Kind of like a
lot of them are
bench is better.
Yeah. It would have to be specifically because again, I think my wife has a similar sort of has had similar back issues. And again, the answer is you basically need to work out. You know what I mean? You need to do a lot of sort of strength training to make sure your back's strong. Sitting all day is a full-time, hardcore, extreme sport. You know what I mean? It's very dangerous for you to do it. And if you don't do it wrong, if you don't do it right, you will get back issues, like guaranteed pretty much, if you're just sitting there and you're not sort of strength training. And strength training means like lifting weights, you know what I mean? Like getting strong, so you can lift stuff, like that's what will make a difference, I think. Not heaps heavy stuff, not like, doing like, I'm gonna deadlift like 500 kilos. Like, no, but you should be able to pick up something that's like 50 kilos and be like, yeah, sure, not a problem. Like that will genuinely fix it, right? You're just doing that. Not like smashing it and trying to get there in 1 week, being like, in the next 5 years, I'm going to slowly build up and being able to like, be able to just lift stuff and be strong. That's what will sort of fix it over time. If you have a specific back issue, like some of these chairs can allow you to work for a little bit longer than others, maybe, but you would have to really know, again, what the problem is and exactly, what they are. Like you can get ones that are like this, right? Again, where it's kind of like a saddle chair and you can actually sit inverted over it. So you are kind of like facing that way, and then you can kind of lean your sort of abs and sort of stomach on the back, and then you can kind of like work that way. But a lot of it is like super specific to what type of work you're doing. And, again, it's like, that might allow you to work for an extra hour if your back is completely screwed. But yeah, I think as Simon's saying, I would say like, if you're thinking about that and you're like, I don't want to buy a Herman Miller chair, because the Herman Miller chair will basically just allow you to move around, right? And it's a decent chair. Get like an exercise ball and a $10 stool from IKEA, because you basically sort of have to, you can't just relax on those, right? And sort of be, you can't do it wrong. They'll tell you when it's time to like stand up and walk around and take a break.
And most of the time, like when people are having neck problems, I can tell you exactly why that happens. So lots of people get neck problems that work on a Cintiq. Guess why? Because they do this. Right? They'll bend over and they get closer and closer and closer to the screen. And of course, and then you realize you're working for 3 hours like that, right? It's going to hurt after a while. So, just think about it's quite often, I feel most of the problems do come from where you're putting the Wacom tablet. So maybe Emily as well, you got it pretty in front there. So try and work on getting it a bit more out to the right hand side, because then Tim talks about that a bit, where if you have it right at the front, you actually you can't, your pec is in the way of doing stuff. So you actually have to kind of contort yourself, and you don't know you're doing it. You're twisting your back to make some of the strokes. So actually, because I do it quite a lot too, I'll just have it in the middle, because I've been typing emails or something, and I'll start drawing. Wait a minute, I just need to move it a bit over there, because that's a bit more kind of what's the word? Better sort of posture, right? So a bit more ergonomic, right? So there's that. And then the other thing is just paying attention to how close you're getting to the screen. And like, because we tend to do it, it's like you lean in, you're like, look at that little leaf in there, I gotta like paint that. And then all of a sudden you're like out of that nice 90-degree kind of straight up and down sort of thing. So yeah, and a lot of times I think whenever people are having problems like that, which for you, Emily, might be totally different, but anyway, but like it's normally that stuff. It's normally just simple stuff, like your desk height at home is some weird sort of height, or you know, like you don't have the Wacom tablet in a good spot, or you're like, you don't even notice that you're like, you know, leaning into your monitors all the time and stuff, right? So it's just, they're kind of like the main things rather than like your chair and how, you know, it's not that, it's sort of like how you're doing the stuff. Does that make sense? Yeah. Because there's heaps of artists like, you know, Tim and me, we're like, we'll draw and paint like all day, every day, you know what I mean? And just like never have a problem. Or like your hand gets sore because you're like just trying to get work done really fast. You know, like, and you just got to have a bit of a break and manage that. But like, you know, I never really get to a point where it's like, you know, I have like carpal tunnel or, you know, anything like that. It's just, I think a lot of times, like, you know, when people get carpal tunnel and stuff, I'll see like how they're holding the pen and things. I'm like, of course you're going to, you know what I mean? It's just like looking at that stuff, just thinking, okay, let's work all this out and try and be as comfortable as I can. So.
And you got to understand that, like, you know, when sort of, you know, Simon's saying like figure out how to hold the pencil, you know, again, it's tricky because I don't have my camera set up. I can't like show you that sort of stuff, but you really do have to optimize. You can't just be like, oh, this is how I hold a pencil. It's like, no, like think about the way that's best to hold a pencil for long-term hand health. You know what I mean? Because I know a lot of people again, will hold it differently.
Difference.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you listen to like Kim Jong-gi, like he draws a lot, and I think he always says like, you know, he's just had a light grip on the pen a lot of the time, and he's often drawing with like a brush. You know what I mean? It's a lot easier to do that than sort of if you're sort of grinding away at something. So the simple things are just use a again, you know, soften up the Wacom sort of settings so that, you know, you're not having to press super hard. Again, have some different grips on the pen if you can. You can also just use basic sort of, you know, like grip strength stuff. If you are sort of thinking about that, again, like, you know, if you're not doing exercise or, you know, any of those sort of things, you can get these things pretty cheap on like, you know, eBay or Amazon or whatever, you know, just this kind of nonsense. I don't know whether, like, you know, these sort of things. I found that it does actually work pretty well if you just kind of like warm your hand up, that stuff. Again, like not expensive stuff, just like not like hard sort of like strength training one, just like any old one. And yeah, it just kind of like warms your hand up a bit, work the kinks out of it a bit, you know. Yeah, but yeah, I haven't had huge problems, you know what I mean, with any of that sort of stuff. Yeah, you know, that stuff's like pretty cheap and sort of easy to do. But yeah, you know, again, if you want to get a chair, I would say don't spend money on a bad chair. You know, get a really good one if you can, because again, it should last you forever. I know a lot of people they spend $600 on a chair and then they go back and buy an Aeron chair later, because yeah, it just allows you to sort of move around a little bit, right? And I've got other chairs that do that. And the Aeron chair still just sort of works a little bit better. So I just find it sort of doesn't. I just don't have those issues, right? Yeah, but I think, as Simon is saying, like a lot of those things are there to alleviate back pain, right? So someone has a back that's completely stuffed and they can't work, you know what I mean? And it's kind of like, you know, they're working in an office or something like that. And, you know, I think offices are full of those like $400 to $600 ergo chairs, right? Or like, you know, Back Support Australia, you know, certified chair, and it's basically a black foam chair that has heaps of lumbar support, right? Or heaps of neck support. So it's basically there to kind of like paralyze you into a position or sort of like push your back out because your back's sort of hurting because you're in a chair for sort of 8 hours a day. And there's a lot of people who basically can't work, you know, due to carpal tunnel or, you know, those sorts of things. And so these things are there to be like, often I think, they're just selling them there so like, you know, they can get an extra work done at work and an extra hour of work done. And no one really cares whether or not they, you know what I mean? It's all just like, oh, well, you know, this will solve your problem right now. But yeah, I don't think that will ever, an ergonomic chair isn't going to stop you getting, isn't going to fix back pain, right? But it might help you not get it. But not if it has lumbar support or whatever. Yeah. Because you basically, lumbar support is called abs. And all the other muscles that I don't know the words for that are on your back and support your abs. That's what gives you lumbar support. Anyway, what were we talking about? Metal and rubber. Yeah. I mean, I don't know whether anyone else has got an Aeron chair. I've got one, and I tell people to buy one, but I don't know whether anyone has. But that's literally the first thing I ever bought. I literally got my check. I went and bought an Aeron chair. I knew that's what I wanted. Yeah. And I haven't had any back problems from that. I had back problems from holding 3-year-olds all the time. That's not good for your back. You know what I mean? I'd be like, yeah, that's the number one thing I tell people who are like parents expecting. I'm like, okay, sit-ups. Make sure your back is good, because yeah, that will kind of do it. Yeah, don't hold children with one arm on one side like repeatedly. Yeah, so yeah, I think you do have to pay attention to that though. I think that's really worth doing. But I think the basic stuff is like, yeah, if you're feeling a bit uncomfortable, just sit up, walk around. I think the more you sit up, walk around, get sort of blood flow, you're more likely to sit down well. And I think you're better off, again, with an exercise ball. Like, I think that's a lot of people, like that helped you, Simon, having an exercise ball. Is that right? When your back was in trouble?
I found it really crap. I don't like it.
Right. So nothing worked really? It was sort of just...
Nothing like that's going to fix your back. Like if your back's really proper FUCKED, that's what I'm saying. It's like none of that stuff's going to help, right? What's going to help is a surgeon going in there and fixing up the bits that are broken, right? And then it will be fixed. Because I know, because I was like, I put up with it for ages, and I was doing everything. I just like doing it because I was playing like state league basketball in Melbourne at that time, right? So I'm like, I'm just popping painkillers like they're, you know, M&Ms. I'm doing like all this stuff. I go to physio 4 times a week, and they got me upside down doing, you know, because like we had like a team physio and all this, like, yeah, right. So I'm doing all this stuff, and while I'm trying to, you know, go to work and draw pictures as well, and like, you know, just nothing. That, like a chair's not going to help. You know what I mean? It's not. That's not the problem.
Once it's screwed, it's very.
It's just like you can get some relief in certain different ways. But yeah, I just found like they're like, oh, sit in a ball and do like the stand-up thing. I'm like, all these things like make it worse. You know?
So I've heard the stand-up desks. People are not so bullish on those anymore. Yeah, I think it's to me again the number one highest hierarchical thing is just variety. You want variety, and you want your setup to allow you to have variety. So someone was talking about the Cintiq tablet. Make sure it can move around, right? Like having it on an arm, I think is really good. All this stuff is impossible if you're a student, right? That's the problem, because like you guys are having to sort of drag it in. Yeah, and it all costs money, right? But like, you know, the arm doesn't cost that much if you're just, you know, you can get one for like, like $60 or something like that if you're just have a smaller Cintiq. If you have a big Cintiq, you kind of need a bigger one. But you can actually just take the arm and just pull it off the table. If you mount your Cintiq arm in the middle of the table, like drill a hole in it, then you can just sort of pull it around. So that's what I do. I don't have a standing desk because, again, I'm just like, that just seems like huge fuss. But, you know, I'll often just be moving it around. You know what I mean? I'll be like, you know, I'm sort of over this side of it, you know, and I'm kind of like leaned over, sort of drawing, and then I'm kind of like moving over here. And again, the Aeron chair actually allows you to recline a bit. So I would sometimes, especially I did this when I was working on like sort of Wacom, not on a Cintiq, is I can literally be like almost like fully reclined, right? Like laying back. with my legs like fully extended out, you know, well beyond the other side of my desk. I've got like one arm like straight out, you know what I mean? And the other arm's like doing the Wacom, the other arm's straight out on the desk. And I'm just kind of like looking up at the monitor. And I kind of like do that for an hour. And then I'll like sort of move around, like get up, and I'll like sort of perch on the front of the chair for like an hour. So it's just getting used to like sort of moving around, right? But if your whole system is like static, it's hard to do that. You know what I mean? Like if your chair won't let you do that, or, you know, like again, you don't have a Cintiq arm, or, you know, like it's a lot of it is sort of adding those things. But if you're younger and you don't have the money, the best thing is like, just get up and walk around, you know what I mean, more. I've had the exercise ball. I just sort of found it a little bit annoying. You know, it just didn't work as well as the Aeron chair, right? But yeah, I haven't sort of compared it. You know, it's obviously more expensive. but I did sit on an IKEA stool for a long time. Because I was living somewhere, right, without it. And I traveled around South America for, you know, sort of 6 months at least, and I was drawing comics just in shitty, like whatever chair was in the place you're sort of renting, you know. You know, and I think a lot of it is just you get used to like saying, you just get used to like not accepting the pain. Does that make sense? Like you sort of are just like, oh, that feels a bit funny, I'm going to do this. But I would say, Simon, the other thing that Cintiqs really do that screws you up is you often have the keyboard offset. So your keyboard is not like directly in front of you. So I will do this often where I'm kind of like working on my sort of, you know, Cintiq, and my sort of, you know, I've got like one hand on the keyboard, and that's great for Photoshop. But then when I'm like, I have to type, I actually kind of like move my whole body over and twist my back in this like, exactly the thing you should never do, right? And then I kind of just type. And that's okay if you type once. But sometimes I'll just find myself and I'm like, at the end of the day, I'm like, man, my back is not good. Like, what was I doing? And I'm like, oh, that's right. I was basically like completely twisted over, like on a side, you know what I mean? Like typing on a keyboard that's kind of, you know, way over to the left of me. So I think you just have to be aware of that, and just like, you just get used to train yourself to sort of be like, feeling a bit sort of stiff or whatever, let's like get up, do some stuff. The other thing you can do if you're struggling with any of that is do your sort of like, sort of timer sort of system, your like Pomodoro sort of tomato timer style stuff. Every 30 minutes have an alarm go off, and every time the alarm goes off, you sort of just get up and do push-ups or walk around the room, or, do you know what I mean? Like jump up and down, do something like that. So if you don't have money to solve these problems with like bits of rubber gadgets and stuff, you can do it through simple stuff like that. You know what I mean? But yeah, I don't know how long were you in the industry before your back started hurting? It sounds like it was more basketball and sport that was sort of doing.
Oh no, 100%. Yeah,
bad,
nothing to do with drawing. Yeah, nothing to do with drawing. So,
or it's like a mix of maybe like doing intense physical exercise and then sort of sitting down all day or something like that.
Yeah,
I don't know. Like you don't know. It's like a mix of sort of stuff.
Yeah, it's like all those things. They build up. But yeah, I think the main thing is like, a lot of times you're just doing things that you're not quite aware of, and that's normally like hurting your body a bit. So yeah, I think the Cintiqs are definitely worse for neck pain. I find that more people seem to get neck pain with the Cintiq, and it's to do with the fact that you're just leaning over the thing to draw on it, right? And then the Wacom tablet, you get less neck stuff going on, but more kind of wrist stuff. And then a lot of times that's about like where you're doing it and how you're holding the pen. So just look after yourself, guys. Like it's like everything in life. You just gotta do everything in moderation. You gotta you gotta try and keep active and do those things.
Boring stuff.
Yeah. So and there's just what you gotta do in life. Yep.
Yeah, it's quite. It is. Yeah, it's all boring. Hey, it's all like that. It's not.
So back to Geoforms, Tim.
Damn it! Can't we keep talking about ergonomic stuff?
Do you want to do some feedback?
let's do some feedback, because I feel like people are sort of getting sort of the general idea here. And look, a big part of it is like you guys sort of need to learn how to figure some of this stuff out yourself, right? So, you know, that's part of the experiment, right? Like don't feel like this is sort of one and done. You know, again, this is you learning how to extrapolate these materials, right? So the basic thing is we're going to do a sheet of these in rubber and a sheet of these in metal, okay? And, you know, you can do it as, you know, the sort of gold metal or whatever. The question is just, we're going to look at it and see, does it look rubbery or does it look metally? Like, that's it. It's pretty subjective, you know, and we'll just sort of talk about that, right? But again, you're not going to be able to do this if the underlying form is not good, right? And you haven't understood the basics of the material. See what else you can add. You can maybe play around with some of the brush techniques I sort of mentioned, or try some custom brushes, play around with it. You know what I mean? See what you come up with. But yeah, that's basically do a set of these in rubber and a set of these in metal, and try and figure out for yourself. Because if you figure this out, then you're going to be able to look at any photo reference or any reference and then be able to sort of replicate that material. That's basically the goal, right? So that's what you should aim towards, not necessarily being like, exactly how am I doing it? You kind of have to figure out sort of like, how are you going to do that? I've sort of showed you how to rough in the form, think about it. That's what you need to follow from what I've been doing. But the next step, the next sort of 10 to 20%, I think is a little bit more personal, right? You know, and that's where the creativity comes in, and the observation comes in, and the experimentation comes in. But yeah, let's do some feedback. Do you have some stuff to go through, Simon?
I don't specifically, but yeah.
All right, cool. Let's look at what people done. How much time have we got? Oh, so we've got sort of 30 minutes. Do you want to maybe, I'll just sort of quickly look at a few, and maybe you can sort of grab you can maybe like see if you can find a couple of good ones as well. And then I'll just do sort of a couple, but yeah, I'll just sort of look, I'll go from maybe the top and just sort of check out what sort of people have been doing. I'd say also kettlebells are really good. If you want a simple exercise that will kind of like help your back and everything, like just sort of align everything. I find if I do, and again, you need to consult a doctor or a physio, make sure you can actually do a kettlebell, figure out how to do a kettlebell. But like, I find if I do like
deadlifts,
kettlebells are quite, you could do them wrong. But I find, like, honestly, kettlebells is a relatively cheap thing. If I do, like 10 minutes of kettlebell swings or something like that, just like this most basic thing, which is very much a back sort of, it's a whole body sort of exercise. I just feel like everything works that day. You know what I mean? Like, just everything's kind of lined up, it's kind of like just sort of syncs everything up. So I'd say definitely, like, don't just kind of get out of bed and slump into a chair for the whole day. You know what I mean? A lot of it is just very, very simple things like that, jump up and down a bit, get your blood flow going, all that sort of stuff. But sitting in chair all day is an extreme sport. It's very dangerous. Cool. All right. So these are Quins. I think these are looking pretty good. I feel like we need to work on the sort of core shadow, sort of basic sort of stuff there. I feel like the chrome ones are pretty good. I think it's probably because you're sort of referencing the shadows, and I think, like, if you just reference the stuff that's there, it looks pretty good. But I think we need to work a little bit more on these areas, right? Like, what's happening here, I don't think that's quite understood. So we need to work on sort of the core shadow separation. Where's that termination point between light and dark? I'll see if I can put these in a folder, thingy. What are we in? We're in second year. get rid of these ones. Cool. Just a few. Nice. Aaron? Yeah, I think those are looking cool. Maybe have a little bit more, I feel like a little bit more core shadow might help the sphere a little bit, but I think otherwise those are looking really good. Yeah, cool. Still got some other stuff. Yeah, those are looking good too. Yeah, so again, I'll just quickly go through these and see, because I feel like that's probably enough of a general idea. Yeah, I feel like maybe some of these might be like a little bit soft, some of the reflections. I think in general it's sort of looking good. These seem very sort of soft compared to like sort of these ones here. I don't think maybe it's going to reflect quite so harsh, that sort of white. There's no real sort of white anywhere else in the scene that it's going to sort of do that. And here, I think again, it's looking pretty good. It feels like this reflected light's a little bit hot, a little bit sort of harsh there. I think we could again get better, like more core shadow separation here. Again, I feel like that's like another sort of good example. Cool. All right. Yeah, again, a little bit more core shadow, sort of reflected light separation. Overall, it's looking pretty good though. Again, I think that's like overall that's looking pretty good. I feel like this is getting a little bit sort of brushy there, right? Like a little bit sort of, you know, we're seeing a little bit of sort of like awkwardness around the place. It's not looking quite so clean here. I think that's looking pretty good, but again, I feel like maybe some of the Fresnel effect is like a little bit harsh here and there. Yeah, so I think it's just a matter of like a little bit more finesse here. Again, we need a bit more ambient occlusion. Again, maybe slightly softer sort of transition. A few things like that, but overall pretty good. Again, that this feels a little bit sort of brushy, right? Yeah. Cool. Nice. Cool. So again, just a little bit sort of brushy there. What I mean by brushy, because we have had that before, and people are like, what are you talking about? What do you mean by brushy? It just means I can sort of see some brush strokes, right? And it's meant to be sort of a little bit sort of chrome and clean. Yeah, you know, sort of these feel a little bit sort of cleaner. Again, that's because, again, they feel like they're following that reference quite closely. But yeah, we just need to sort of make sure that we've got some clean separation there.
Yeah, so I think one of those main notes, Tim, is that you'll notice that with the chrome stuff, you want to be very like Photoshop toolsy, not many brush strokes. You know, keep it more mechanical in terms of the way that you're doing it. You know, in terms of the rubber one, right? You can see what Tim's doing. You can be more organic and you can be a bit more brushy with that stuff. So once again, it's about understanding the hierarchy of what you're doing. You know, how to put it together and how you should, what tools you should use to you know, to do that. So like, you know, if Craig, like I was saying before, like if Craig Mullins was going to do this, he probably wouldn't show you how to do a chrome sphere with the hard round brush. You know what I mean? So he would get all the tools
Yeah.
and do it like that. But with the rubber one, you know, he'd do that more with the hard round brush and make it all textured and stuff. Does that make sense? Yep. Just yeah.
Yeah, there's no rules, right? Like it's there's no one rule like that works for everything. It's you need to use the correct tool for the right job. And that's why we sort of start learning the technical, artificial looking tools first, because they're often less intuitive, right? And I feel like they're easier to sort of copy. So once you're up to that stage and you can kind of really get that sort of stuff sorted, then you can sort of move on, right? You can be like, oh, if I add more stuff here, right, with texture, that sort of thing, then it kind of works, right? But you can always step back to the more mechanical version. Whereas it's hard to go the other way, you know what I mean? Cool, these are Samuel's. So again, the standard sort of matte one, I feel like we need some more sort of core shadow work, right? Again, I feel like it's just sort of a little bit sort of artificial. Again, that sort of looks like that's emotionally sort of lit, right? From a sort of an awkward direction. So again, there's going to be like similar sort of ideas there, right? More core shadow, and I'll cover that when I do sort of a quick sort of paint over, right? Again, same thing here. We just need to sort of work on those basic sort of rendering things. A little bit more sort of core shadow, a little bit more ambient occlusion, a little bit more gradation, right? Between the sort of, again, we do have a separation, like this is in light and this is dark, but again, it's a curved form. So the entirety of the form is going to sort of have a gradient up it to some degree to change, to show that, again, all of the different sort of facets and sort of surfaces, from sort of the side to the top are sort of facing the light differently, and they're going to receive different amounts of light. The glossy ones are looking pretty cool. Yeah, I feel like that's sort of working nicely. But again, we're not going to, the reflections are kind of straight across, right? More like this one, right? Again, this one looks really cool. That's looking nice. This one, again, feels sort of tilted, like, again, with sort of the reflection is sort of mirroring a little bit more the core shadow, whereas it should just be sort of straight across. But yeah, overall, I think that's like going in a good direction, but I feel like we just need a little bit more focus on those basics to sort of get those ones sort of working. Yeah, cool. I feel like that's looking, again, if you sort of look back, it looks sort of glossy. Might be like a little bit harsh. I think mine was a little bit harsh too, like the sort of level of reflection. But I think, again, that sort of looks pretty good. It's looking sort of shiny. This is looking, again, pretty sort of chromed. Here, I think we need a little bit more of a gradation between the light and the dark, and I feel like that could just be a general theme, right? There's sort of some of these sort of lines maybe a little bit sort of harsh. Again, as these lines wrap around the form, right? These reflections, they get lost a little bit more, right? So just keep that in mind. But I think overall that's looking good. Just like softer transitions. Again, the 3D renders have those quite harsh transitions, but yeah, I would try and keep it a little bit sort of softer. Cool. So again, here, not sure whether we've got a gloss in one of these. I feel like some of this is looking good, but yeah, more ambient occlusion, just a little bit more sort of sophistication. Because again, there's a lot of reflected light over here, but I don't think there would be that much there. This one's looking cool, nice and sort of shiny. Yeah, so again, I feel like some areas of it are working well. It's looking, again, a little bit sort of brushy over here. I think you've done a good job of it, but it's still a little bit brushy, and I think we could get some Fresnel effect on the chrome, right? So that's, the same sort of things, right, are gonna sort of keep popping up, right, which is totally sort of fine. Yeah, so if you're finding that you are struggling to get, right, just like, those sort of basics there, which I think, again, for sort of Quinn, I think that's sort of happening. We just need to remember, again, we've got halfway to black from our sort of local color, right, which in this case is going to be sort of 30 or something. And what we need to do is just separate out the light side from the dark side. right? So we need to be more like that. So less sort of, right? And then we can think about, okay, let's have like a small amount of reflected light, right? And then you can think about sort of adding ambient occlusion or those sort of things. Right. Invert that selection. Right, so let's just try and get that sort of stuff, sorted. Right, so we need to differentiate light from dark. Right, now we can think about reflected light. Right, remember ambient occlusion, right? And let's again join it together with ambient occlusion on the ground. This is very rough, right? But those are the steps you need to sort of work on, right? Same for those. And again, here I feel like we're sort of getting a little bit lost, right? Whereas what we need to do is pay attention to the chrome reflection, and then again pay attention to the how the chrome and the matte sort of join each other, right? But I think it's basically just let's work on the matte version first, right? Because I feel like that's affecting sort of everything else. These ones actually look pretty good because again, I think you're sort of following those rules. Yeah, when it comes to this stuff, let's be a little bit softer, a little bit more airbrush, and let's again separate light and dark. So yeah, again, I feel like these are looking pretty good. It's sort of working nicely. I just feel like yeah, right. Sort of what I mean is just if it's sort of like, again, I feel like it's like pretty good, right? And here we've got sort of 70, right? And we sort of got, you're at sort of 39, so like the core shadow is sort of 39. I feel it should be a little bit darker, right? I'd always make the core shadow a little bit darker versus a little bit lighter, right? Because you're sort of exaggerating the effect, right? So it's just a matter of light. Right,
yeah, and the reason why that's really useful is because then it gives you room to paint in the reflected light. Because remember, the reflected light can never be as bright as the local light value. Does that make sense? Because it's like
so you never want to have like reflected light like that, unless it's unless it's super reflective. But if you're just painting matte, you want to sort of, and even just as a general painting rule, you always want to separate everything on the light side from everything on the dark side, because it aids the eye, right? It helps your viewer understand what's lit and what's not. So the general rule there is that the darkest value from your light side, right? So the darkest value in the light, right? So everything's lit, but what is like the darkest value in your areas where you're sort of, showing light, that shouldn't be sort of, like darker than the lightest light within your shadows, right? So you sort of bracket the shadows, right? And you don't have any sort of values that are in the light kind of be in the shadow, basically, and vice versa, which is tricky, but that will help readability, right? So again, if you're trying to paint something hyper realistic, you might have more subtlety than that, but the more you move towards that separation, the better things will be. So it's just, again, a little bit more, right? A little bit more sort of core shadow, right? A bit more core shadow there, right? I think that'll sort of help it. And again, here, I feel like this is looking sort of pretty cool. I think there's some good stuff happening there. Again, you could probably add a little bit more sort of ambient occlusion. Right, might help you there. Again, I'm not doing a very good job of painting it in, but a little bit more there might sort of help place that. But those are the main things I see, right? And the main things that I see that are sort of gonna trip people up, right? Oh, that's the same one. What did I have? I thought I had a different one. Oh, no, it's copied the same one. You silly thing. It's obviously not my fault. It's obviously the computer's fault that it did that. Cool, so that's Aaron's and Quinn's. So what else did we have? We had, I think this one would also be a good example. Yep. And yeah. Again, just do a few, will kind of help us. Again, I feel like a lot of these are looking really good. But again, the things that I notice most of the time are, you know, they're the same things, right? It's often that, like, I feel like if people understand the basic one, they're sort of more likely to, you know, understand the rest of them. So here, again, what we want is kind of a mix of this one and this one, right? So we kind of need to, right? You need to sort of start with, like, you know, what is that sort of base color, right? Like, what is sort of going on? So I feel like this one is a little bit sort of confused, because we basically want to sort of combine the matte version with this, right? So I feel like this one's getting a little bit lost, Samuel. And again, I think that's probably because this one is not fully sort of understood. And I feel like, again, it's really easy to sort of see where those sort of reflections should go, right? Like, that's looking really cool, actually. But this, right, we've got sort of 85, and I want to sort of, what's that, sort of 40 something, right? So you can see, again, I'm sort of needing a more of a separation, and then we want sort of, again, gradation between the light and the dark side there. But the thing that I think often happens to people is they do sort of paint back and forward a little bit, right? And that's where it's very easy to get stuff lost, right? That happens when you're painting for real too. So, you know, it's worth sorting out, right? Making sure you don't lose the core shadow, right? And that's why I think it's always better, right, to sort of put in that core shadow, you know, a little bit sort of stronger rather than a little bit, right, rather than a little bit softer, right? It'll sort of always help you to maintain it, right? Again, as I'm sort of doing here, if I paint a little bit of stuff into it, right, I'm not sort of losing that value. Right, so again, I feel like the reflected light you had was sort of working well, but it's kind of more over here, right? We sort of go back, right? Again, there's sort of not much there. So the value you had for the whole shadow is actually sort of what we would probably want for the, right, again, for that sort of reflected light. So let's just make sure, yeah, we get those things happening. Same thing here, right? We need that's sort of 20, right? So core shadow, looks like that value is kind of right. It's just that we need more sort of gradation, and then we need, you know, a little bit of reflected light potentially. And then we need a little bit of that ambient occlusion. Again, super rough, but that's basic idea. Yeah, and again, always make sure you can see, even just in the process of me doing that, right, kind of weaken that core shadow, right? So the more we can kind of punch that up, the better. Again, I feel like this, we've got similar sort of issue. We need to mix this and this for the gloss, right? So go check that out. Again, here, again, I feel like this one's looking really good, and the render does really separate out. It gives us this sort of harsh sort of form here, which it you know, it is not the worst thing, but I'm not sure why it does that. You know, I think having some sort of showing the form better is probably a good place to start. But it is really giving you a, you know, that sort of clean separation. But yeah, I'd probably soften that out a little bit, right? Just so you can kind of show the form a little bit more. But again, this is where, you know, looking at reality will probably be better, right? A lot of this is going to depend on what light is lighting it, how close it is, etc., etc. But if we're trying to show form, I'd probably try to keep it a little bit softer. But look at the reference, right? Sometimes it is very harsh, right? but I think again that's very relative to sort of how soft the light is, how far away the light is from the object, etc., etc. So again, if you're curious about those things, get some spherical objects, test them out, see how you go. And we can maybe look at that as well in the future. So I'll see if I can get my camera set up properly, and we can use the sort of geoform foam things we've got, and sort of just look at how some of that actually functions in the real world. Maybe we'll do that next week.
Yeah,
Someone remind me. I'll put a note or something. Yeah, cool. Anyway, so those are the main sort of points that I would make, right? And it feels like again, it's sort of like you can copy the Chrome quite easily. I don't know whether you've got a few you want to talk about, Simon, or some.
Yeah, I
can
have
a few that you. Yep. Cool. Well, I'll stop sharing. I'll make a few notes on here, but yeah, it feels like the Chrome is sort of easy once you see it in person, right? In practice on those things, it's very easy to understand. Like, oh yeah, you just put this in and that in, and then it kind of works. It's quite easy. But it's a matter of sort of again mixing those ideas of pure reflection, and again being able to use the pure reflection in the real world, right, where you've got lots of complicated objects and different colors. And yeah, I think everyone who's sort of still struggling a little bit with the core form, right, is going to struggle with some of the other stuff, right? So just remember, the core stuff is the most important.
Yeah, and one of the things I thought would be really cool to kind of show. Now I've been talking about a lot of this stuff. Is I think John Wallen-Liberto is like a really awesome exponent of how this can work in kind of like a loose, expressive way. Yeah, so you kind of look at this stuff and you're like, it's like how he describes all of this stuff. You can see all the like reflected lights and the kind of halfway to black. It's all of those rules that is like really not rules, but you know what I mean. Those kind of principles that he's really taking on board. That's how he can paint stuff like this. And then you look at it, it's like so loose and yeah, awesome, right? But you can see like all of that stuff's going on. Like the when he renders, it's like really subtle. It's definitely that halfway to black kind of thing. He's always thinking about sort of reflected light and how these forms, change and stuff in kind of space, like a bit less like, that whole thing where it's like, oh, let's pick a highlight and then let's do a shadow and the shadow goes at the bottom. He kind of like does a lot of that in reverse because that's how it kind of works, like as it's getting closer to the ground, it's picking up more reflection from the ground and is painting in like the yellow lines from the ground. Can you guys all see that? Like, see how that's the same stuff that you're doing with kind of like the chrome spheres and things? It's just the same thing. He's just thinking about like, oh, there's a car and this has to reflect. And like, to be honest, probably like none of this is like, accurate, right? Like he's not plotting this stuff out. He's just being like, I know that if I put a yellow stripe in there and I know if I like saturate the color a bit more and, make it feel like it's reflected light, it's going to make this form like turn and just read kind of better, Like it's just, yeah, and he's like, just smush, put that in. So, yeah, those sorts of things. But yeah. That's what I think is really cool for you guys now to like, to look at these things and look at how like really good artists are controlling that stuff. Because, yeah, I mean, there's lots of people that are not, right? And then there's people that are really good that are like, that are super in tune with kind of like how this stuff works, like even just this little bit down here, like it's awesome, just how he gets that like 1, 2, 3 read, and yeah, it's just sort of how those techniques go, the shadow, and it really does feel like that sort of halfway to black. And I'd probably say in John's case, he literally would do that. He would use the HSB sliders like Tim and kind of like just be like, oh, he wouldn't even say it in a thing. He'd just be like, well, that's like a whatever it is, a 25, and then the other one's the halfway to black, and he just slides it down and boom, just paints that bit in. You know what I mean? Yeah, and so it's just that one's a bit more, less sort of bit more abstract, but you know, even in here, just, you know, how it's reflecting, and just thinking about like, it's not just light at the top and dark at the bottom, you know, it's got that cylindrical form, and there's a lot of reflected light and bounce light and all those sorts of things going on. And that's how he's capturing these like subtle forms that are connecting into each other, which are just literally your geoforms that are like, yeah, going into one another, right? So, because we're doing a lot of that with the first years at the moment, you know, with the trees and stuff, right? You know, and did the trees and how you're trying to put the, you know, the branches into the tree trunks and connect those like complicated forms. Yeah, it's just all that stuff is. So yeah, I think it's a really good example of how it's, you know, of how you can take, you know, cool sci-fi awesome stuff, you know, like this would be like, you know, when Tim and I are talking about the League of Legends splash screen, like this is what we mean, right? You know, it's like you don't draw it just flat in the cone of vision, all that kind of stuff, right? You just go nuts with it. But you can see then John is then applying all of that kind of knowledge stuff to this, yeah, and it's becoming kind of second nature. So yeah, just some examples of where that can kind of lead to. As Tim was talking, I thought like, you know, I was just like, John Wallen-Liberto, that's the guy that does it really well. Yeah.
It used to be called, I think his name still is on everything. It's like Captain Flushgarden, and he, I remember him on forums in like 2000 was like I think like a fairly young sort of kid who was sort of really pursuing that Craig Mullins sort of painting stuff. And he's sort of always been quite good at that, but you can probably find some of his older work. I mean, it's probably all hidden now, right? Yeah. But, you know, like he, you know, learned a lot of this stuff, and he did a lot of these sort of exercises and did all these sort of speed paintings and, you know, practiced these concepts, you know, and, you know, has been doing this for a long time, you know, probably the same sort of time that I've been doing it, right?
Yeah, I'd say he's like a similar age to us, you know, and yeah, so probably been doing this for like 20 years, you know, and yeah, it takes a lot of practice, right, to get that good. So yeah, don't just think like, oh, it's just going to be like Liberto, you know, tomorrow, because yeah, that's not going to happen either, right? Like it's taken him a long time to get it to that point. But yeah, I mean, a lot of the feedback from this stuff is just exactly the same as you've been doing, Tim, which is like, yeah, a lot of the gloss and the chrome is looking really quite good, guys. Like, yeah, doing an awesome job of that. And then I feel like some of the matte ones is where it just falls down a little bit, because maybe you're just getting into that thing of like, oh, I just got to do a hard line here, and that will be the gloss. And then when you get into the matte one, you sort of forget to really make it turn the corner. And then just like the only notes, like, so whenever it just falls down a bit, like, so like George, whenever it doesn't just quite look as good, it's just because it gets a bit brushy in those areas, and you're just like not paying attention to some of those like heavy duty kind of rules that you try not to break. And I don't mean rules as in like you have to do it like this, but try to keep like a hierarchy of stuff. So things like, you know, the reflected light is kind of getting the same, you know, value as like the local value of the sphere, right? And it's just like it can't do that, you know, because it's in the shadow. So it's the reflected light that's in the shadow. It's still got to be in the shadow. Does that make sense, guys? So like it will be lighter, but just not as light as this, you know? And like Tim just showed, he just showed the exact example, you know, like it's just not halfway to black here, you know? So it needs to be darker in that core shadow, which then can fade off a bit into that reflected area, which means that it's darker, right, than what you've got here, but just not as dark as that core shadow part, right? Yep. And then when you're doing your rubber and stuff, it's like, then you get people like this where they start like painting, they'll paint the texture where the like highlight meets the shadow, you know, where you have that terminator, right? So where the local color or the highlight meets that shadow, that's the terminator. And then you paint your texture in there, because that's where the eye wants to kind of like see it. It's like when you have like your things and you hold them up in the light or whatever, and they catch the light, you know, and you can see the texture on something. It's always happening in that bit from the shadow to the light bit. That's where it happens. The light bit just looks flat, you know, but the transition between the light and dark, that's where if you know, get like a foam sphere or just stuff, you know, just hold it up to light and see how it works. You see that's how it always happens, kind of thing. And there's a lot of you know, Tim's been over the reasons why that happens, right? Because the other side is then getting into that Fresnel effect, you know, and just starting to pick up, you know, the sky, right? So then that bit will be kind of more flat, you know, and it's hard for the light to pick up the texture in that area because of the angle to your eye and things like that, right? So just look around at those things and try and understand how that goes. And yeah, so like in these drawers, just get a bit brushy in things. That's the feedback that I noticed is like, yeah, when they don't look quite as like, you know, schmicko, it's just, that's where, you know, like, oh yeah, just getting a bit wonky, you know, around here. It's like, it's reflecting over here. Like, I don't really know why, it just sort of is, you know, like, yeah. So it's just all that stuff like Tim's saying, you know, this shadow kind of, you know, kind of goes down there, but, you know, it sort of needs to, it's the core shadow of the little egg, you know, so it just needs to sort of come around a little bit more because it's kind of this, right? It's following that sort of form. It's these like kind of, these sort of lines won't change, you know, so that's sort of like what it's doing. Whereas here it's like, you're sort of saying that this, you know, the sort of, the reflected ceiling or whatever, like would come down here, you know, and then it's like the eggs twisted in space, right? So that's just why, you know, that sort of looks like a bit funky, you know. So it's all just like little things. Like I said, yeah, I think you guys are doing a really awesome job. Like these are looking cool. You know, maybe Jasmine here, just getting a bit like, this one feels like a bit like an unfounded gradient in here. You know, it gets a bit bright, and it might be as well because this is getting a bit dark. So it's just, you know, it's like 5% here, 5% there. Like Tim was saying before, it's like in those subtleties, just playing within those subtleties, and just, yeah, and you keep working at it. Yeah, and Michael, so this is the same stuff like Tim was talking about before, you know, like some of these ones here, like they just look a bit flat because you just haven't quite done the halfway to black, you know, you haven't quite got that core shadow in, which is then not letting you get reflected light in. Does that sort of make sense? It's like you've got to paint it, you got to paint those darker bits in so it will let you sneak in that other stuff, and then that's why those things just like start looking a bit flat. You know, if I want to give you another note, like don't forget that that, you know, the halfway to black rule still applies on the surface that these things are sitting on. So remember that shadow needs to be, you know, halfway to black. So if this one's a 80, you know, that needs to be 40, right? That value. Don't remember, it doesn't relate to the sphere. Okay, so just remember, this could be a white table and this could be a yellow sphere, right? They're different. Does that make sense? They're different. They don't relate to each other, right? This is always halfway to black of the surface that it's sitting on. And remember, if you get a gradient on there, like it's going to change it too, right? It's going to follow that. It's going to follow the gradient as well. So yeah, you know, same thing in here, Michael. It's just like, it's just getting more core shadow and stuff, right? So just keep looking at those references we've got in that folder and just try to train your eye to do those things. You know, doing this over and over again. So just, you know, keep going. And another note I would say is like, you know, if you got some feedback, because I know the TAs have been trying to go through, you know, and get as much, you know, feedback on your Ferraris and things as possible. So if you get some notes on some of this stuff, just go back and try and fix those things up too, because we really want you to get those like ellipses sorted, you know, because when you draw the Ferrari, it's going to cause problems. Right? So yeah, just try and go back and work on that stuff, get it really sorted in your head. So you're like, every time I do an ellipse, I'm going to have that minor axis, major axis, 90 degrees, and then my ellipse needs to be equal quadrants, you know, around those axis, 90 degree axis, you know? So yeah, just if you're getting notes from TAs, just try and apply those things. Not because, remember, different at high school. You know, we could just give you a C+ and you move on with life and you never do it again, right? But that's not what we're doing here. It's like you're going to be doing for the next 80
That'd
years.
That'd be so easy.
Yeah, the thing is, you're doing
man,
it for the next 80 years.
that?
So if you
Can we
don't
just be like, oh, well,
yeah,
they tried.
So if you don't fix
Plus.
it now, you have to fix it next year. And if you don't fix it next year, you got to fix it the year after that. If you don't fix it the year after that, you got to fix it the year after that. Don't you, Duncan? Like we all know this from experience. Like, yes, it's like if I just worked out the matrix now, I wouldn't have to worry about it again. You know, and what I mean by that is like if you work out the formula and the system of how that stuff works, once you've got it in your brain, it just turns on and you kind of never forget it, right? Within reason, because you have to keep practicing, otherwise you do forget a bit. But yeah, so just try and apply those notes. You know, if your spheres don't quite look as schmicko as some of the others in class that have, you know, that you, because I know everyone looks at stuff and whoever you think's are really cool, it's just normally because they're a bit brushy, or you haven't paid attention to the core shadow, or you haven't got your halfway to black stuff working. So just remember, it's all those things we've done, you know, like we've kind of done it like 30 times now, right? So it's like, just keep going, keep doing it until you get it. But like, try not to.
Takes a while.
Yeah. And try not to pass go. Try to like, so like Michael, just really try and work, you know, really try and work on these. Sorry, I got Megan's here as well. Yeah, looking cool. You know, this one, like more core shadow, right? It's losing form. It's just getting flat, you know? So when you look at it, squint, you know, is it flat? Just losing that kind of shape. These are looking really good. Yep, this one looking a bit flat. But yeah, Michael, I would just say like, just keep going at this, right? Just keep going until you just do sphere after sphere after sphere after sphere, you know, until you just get comfortable with it and get it right. Because yeah, it would just like, you know, it's like you can, in my opinion, this is just my opinion, but you can never paint like this until you understand, you know, that. Yeah, I just feel like that's impossible. You know what I mean? It's not like maybe you could do it ever. I feel like it's literally, I would give you $1 million if you couldn't, like, you know, if you can't get the spheres right, there is no way that you can paint that. Does that sort of make sense? But if you can get the spheres right and stuff, and all of the things like the rendering and the perspective and everything, then like you've got a chance. You know what I mean? Yeah.
Yeah. And the problem is, if you do get good at drawing stuff like that without understanding, it's going to be a really long road, because you can't isolate what the problem is, right? So the point with the geoforms is like, we can have this conversation, whereas if we just said, hey, paint a cool thing,
paint that,
then it's like impossible to critique, because sometimes people are able to sort of make stuff look kind of cool, you know, but it like doesn't have those sort of foundational elements in it. And then I think often what happens to those people is they hit a glass ceiling of sort of skill, you know, they sort of just can't get better past a certain point, and it takes them a lot longer. Whereas even though this feels like it takes a long time, relatively speaking, you know what I mean? If this takes you a few years to get, like, that's actually pretty good. Because lots of people kind of, you know, like when I wasn't going to school for this and spending like a year doing it, you know, I mean, I wasted years and years and years and years getting like a little bit better. And I got better at other stuff, you know what I mean? It's not like I was just wasting time, but, you know, this is just quicker. You know, it's a lot quicker and more efficient. And, you know, you're less likely to build bad habits with this stuff. You know what I mean? Often people, if you have to unlearn that, if you get halfway through learning how to paint cool speed painting things, and then you need to unlearn something, it's really hard, you know, whereas if you just get this stuff off the bat, like you understand, you know, the reflected light, core shadow, you know, ambient occlusion, you understand those basic things, and you can have conversations about them, and then you can look at these paintings and not just be like, as I was, like, whoa, that's impossible, I'll never be able to do that, you know? You can now just look at like, oh, these are the things they're doing. It's a lot easier. Like it is genuinely easier and quicker, right? That there's no quicker, cheaper, you know, more fun way to do it than do it with cubes. Because, you know, it's really easy for us to critique, and it's really easy for you to see it and to improve and iterate, you know what I mean? You know, whereas doing it bit by bit is kind of a little bit more torturous, right? Because you're, and I think it also makes the process of you doing those personal pieces harder. You know what I mean? Because you're sort of like, what's wrong? I don't know what's wrong. And, you know, yeah, it's just isolating. It's basic scientific principles, right? You're just controlling variables.
Yeah, and I think like, you know, another good example of this is like Ryan Lang. Where you know, like he works for Disney, so he like did Moana and stuff, but then he also works on like Avengers and things, because he's just like a boss. Just and like with this one, like he's got like a Gumroad tutorial of this, so you can buy it and he says, and he literally the for 80% of this he just paints it exactly like Tim. So he does line sketch, flats, and it's just like a flat comic book style drawing, and then he adds all this other stuff, and it just like, you're like, whoa. And he just takes it from this like flat thing to this like almost like a toy, you know, it's like a 3D model because he just does like ambient occlusion, reflected light, you know, all of those kinds of things. And so I'm not saying that you got to paint like, you know, you don't have to do this painting. Does that make sense? It's like, it just applies sort of across everything. And like, yeah, Ryan can work on so much stuff because he just understands the fundamentals so well that he is so versatile in what he can do. Because I always find like a lot of people are like, yeah, but I don't want to do this. I want to do, you know, like stylized 2D characters or whatever. I'm like, it's the same effing thing, right? It's like, it makes no difference. Yeah, it's like, I guarantee you the people that are like good at that are good at like doing spheres and cubes to some extent as well. And you'll probably find that after a while, like, because we've told you guys this before, like, you will find that fairly quickly you are better than a lot of artists. There will be a lot of artists that don't fully grasp all this stuff. And you guys like in the room are already better than some of them, right? Than probably people that you think are pretty good that are working in the industry. If we got them to do these assignments, they would like not be that great at these either. So remember, we're like setting the bar really high. We're not setting the bar for you guys to come out and just be like, oh, just work on some, you know, newspaper articles in Adelaide and, you know, whatever, right? The bar is like, you know, James Ross McNabb, you know, 473 people applying around the world for a job at Ubisoft in France. And he got the job and he's 22 years old out of CDW. Like, that's what you can do. You know what I mean? And James knows how to do all this shit. And he didn't at the start, and he just like worked his butt off, you know? And it's like, you can do that, you know? You can't if you can't do the stuff, you know? But if you do it, you can, that's the bar that you can get to, right? So yeah, it's like, just remember, it's hard, it's tough, and we had this conversation with the first years yesterday, so going over things again, but it's hard and it's tough, but like, yeah, you can do it. Like, you guys are going to be better than me and Tim when we came out of like university and college and TAFE and you know, all that kind of stuff. Yeah. Like way better, because we're just like trying to, all these things we've learned over the years, we're like trying to teach you, and you're getting it like much earlier. And like, we resisted all this stuff too, you know? So like, we know that this is hard. We know that this is a grind and it's a bit boring because the end goal is sometimes a bit like, feels like, where does this lead to? But it's like, this is what it leads to. You know what I mean? It's like that. It's like, that's what you'll be able to do, you know, when you're like 30, instead of doing it when you're like 45, you know? So yeah, just keep going, keep grinding. It'll, keep getting better. And just do the notes the TA's giving you, try and work on that stuff. And I think a lot of this stuff's looking really awesome, Tim. So
Yeah, and if you do, like, you know, pick up that Gumroad tutorial by Ryan Lang or something and see how this stuff is being really applied. Good. I think what you'll find is like, really, again, the trick is it's actually really difficult to teach people how to draw and be good at art and then make awesome pictures that people are excited about in 3 years, right, or even 4 years. But the point is, like, we want you to be able to say, oh, hey, that looks cool. Ryan Lang's got a Gumroad tutorial. I'm going to take it. And that you can extract all the information from that, right? You understand, like, oh yeah, I understand what reflected light is and shadow is and ambient occlusion is, you know? It doesn't sound like a different language, right? You understand the visual language, the language of sort of art and, you know, how it's sort of broken down. And so then you can just get better at that if you want, you know what I mean? You can take, again, like John Wallen Liberto has got his own Gumroad tutorials, you know, you can see how he does it, right? And we're just giving you that core. And the thing is, it's so hard to do that on your own, right? Because that's one of the things I had to do, is figure out sort of how to do this myself. And it is really challenging to force yourself to do this kind of more boring, mundane stuff. And that's why we sort of focus on it, because we're like, well, let's spend all our time here doing that, because we can kind of push you to do it, and you can see other people doing it, and you can see the difference between, like, when someone applies it, all of a sudden their thing looks shiny, you know. But the goal is not there. The goal is really to just give you a very small thing, which is that baseline foundational understanding of like what people are doing when they, again, make stuff look realistic like that. And then you can kind of see how they do it, and you can analyze that a lot better. Whereas, you know, back in the day, if I was to watch someone's process, you know, like a Craig Mullins process or something, he had a few things out early on, and I was just like, I don't get it. You know what I mean? I'm seeing what you're doing, but I don't get how to do it. You know what I mean? It's like it's not communicating. It just still seems I'm like, no, that's still magic. I don't get it. You know?
Yeah, and I think
I don't
that's
be able
what,
to do that.
that's totally what happens if you like just download this tutorial and like let's say you were like day -1, so the day before you came to CDW, right? And then you like watch this. I guarantee like most people don't really know what the fuck's going on, right? It's just seeing someone like this crazy ninja stuff and just it's pain, blah, blah, blah. But like now you've had all this like extra knowledge imparted on you. You kind of watch it like see, because like he's not going to be like, oh, I'm painting it as though it's a cube, and here's I'm picking halfway to black, and here's where I'm doing the reflected light, because he's just like just like paint this stuff. Does that sort of make sense? Yep. But now you can kind of look at those things and go, oh, I see. I get what, you know, there's perspective here. There's, there's like we're not just doing like cell shaded kind of picking shadows and highlights and, you know, putting them on the edges of things. And we're trying to like create form and do all the things you're learning from the rendering. So I think that's where it's like really cool. So keep looking at the artists that you like, seeing what they're doing, you know, getting as many tutorials as you can and just building up that stuff. But it's good stuff, guys. So I think we'll call that done.
Cool. Sounds good. We'll catch you next week. Good luck rendering rubber and metal and having another crack at the other ones if you still need to. So again, that's basically what we're going to be doing, you know. And what have we got next week? Just quickly, because I think that might be worthwhile sort of going over. So we finish up our sort of material rendering sort of stuff basically in week. What is this?
Week 5 is just
it'll probably be just more feedback, I think, because we were going to do like week 4 was kind of, we were going to just do feedback on material rendering. I sort of done the sort of the rubber and sort of stuff this week. So probably next week we'll just have a little bit of a break from demo and new assignments, and you guys can just kind of, you know, have another week to work on this, right? Just keep doing some of these material rendering things. And then after that, week 6, which is Ferrari, right? And we start the actual process. So
and just anyway, in here,
so good luck with that.
Just in week 4, I put that Jamie Jones brush pack. So that's just there. So like that kind of gives you a whole bunch of brushes that like Tim and everyone kind of uses.
Yeah, everyone uses those, I think, at some point.
Cool. Thanks, guys.
Cool. All right. See you next week.